Hello everyone, I'm Mr. Edison, and I'm here to guide you into a peaceful slumber. If you find this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. I'd love to know where you're from and what time it is as you unwind. So settle in, get cozy, and let the relaxation begin. I'm a 25-year-old female, and I've been a private home caregiver for 7 years now. Working in other people's homes becomes second nature after a while. You learn to navigate unfamiliar kitchens in the dark, memorize which floorboards creak, and distinguish between normal house sounds and something that requires attention. My name is Amelia, and this is the account of what happened during my time working with Mr. Howard Bennett. By March 2020, I'd been Mr. Bennett's overnight caregiver for nearly 3 years. His modest but well-appointed single-story home sat on the edge of an affluent neighborhood that bordered a Native American reservation about 40 minutes outside of Portland. The location offered beautiful views but also isolation. The nearest neighbor was a quarter-mile down the winding road. Mr. Bennett, 84 years old and widowed for over a decade, suffered from arthritis and the early stages of heart failure. He needed someone present overnight primarily for safety reasons, ensuring he didn't fall during bathroom trips and monitoring his condition. His daughter Judith lived 2 hours away and visited weekends, managing his affairs and hiring help like me. My typical overnight shift followed a comfortable routine. I'd arrive at 9 p.m., chat with Teresa, the evening caregiver, about Mr. Bennett's day, then spend an hour or two watching TV with him, usually nature documentaries or classic films. Around 11 p.m., I'd help him prepare for bed, administer his evening medications, and ensure he was comfortable before retiring to my designated guest room 2 doors down from his bedroom. Most nights, I'd be roused 2 or 3 times to assist him to the bathroom. Between these interruptions, I'd sleep lightly, always alert for his call button. It wasn't the most restful work, but it suited my natural night owl tendencies and allowed me to be home during the day with my 4-year-old daughter, Grace. The house itself was well maintained but showed its age. Built in the mid-1970s with dark wood paneling in some rooms, and a kitchen that had last been updated in the early 2000s. It had quirks, as all older homes do. The heating system made occasional banging noises as pipes expanded and contracted. The refrigerator hummed loudly during its cooling cycles. Wind would whistle through a poorly sealed window in the den. After 3 years, these sounds had become as familiar to me as the creaks of my own apartment. Mr. Bennett was an ideal client. Kind, respectful, and appreciative of help without being demanding. He kept to himself mostly, reading historical biographies and tending to his small indoor herb garden. He rarely spoke about his late wife Carolyn, though her presence remained throughout the house in carefully arranged photographs and untouched collections of porcelain figurines. During those 3 years, I never felt uncomfortable in his home, until Thursday, March 12th, when everything changed. That Thursday began like any other. I woke up around noon, spent the day with Grace, prepared dinner with my fiancé Michael, and got ready for work. The weather forecast predicted rain, so I grabbed my hooded jacket before heading out. As I drove through the gradually darkening evening, nothing felt unusual or out of place. The change occurred the moment I stepped through Mr. Bennett's front door. I inserted my key into the lock, turned the knob, and pushed open the heavy oak door. Immediately, a sensation unlike anything I'd experienced before swept over me. A crushing weight pressed against my chest, constricting my breathing. The air inside the house felt thick, almost resistant, as if pushing back against my presence. For several seconds, I stood frozen in the entryway, my hand still gripping the doorknob. The feeling wasn't physical pain, but rather an overwhelming sense of wrongness. The best comparison I can offer is the instinctive dread you feel seconds before receiving terrible news, your body somehow knowing before your mind that something is desperately amiss. I've always been sensitive to atmospheres. My grandmother called it the knowing and claimed it ran in our family. Throughout my life, I'd occasionally felt uneasy in certain places or around certain people without logical explanation. This was different. This was a visceral warning, my entire nervous system screaming at me to turn around and leave. But I couldn't leave. This was my job, and Mr. Bennett depended on me. I forced myself to breathe deeply and step fully inside, closing the door behind me. The interior looked exactly as it always had, warm lamplight illuminating the living room, the subtle scent of lemon furniture polish in the air, the sound of the television murmuring from Mr. Bennet's sitting room. Nothing visibly different, yet everything felt wrong. Teresa met me in the hallway, her expression neutral as she gathered her purse and jacket. Evening was quiet, she reported routinely. He had his dinner at 6, took his medication at 7:30, and has been watching TV since then. Blood pressure readings are in the log, all normal. I wanted to ask if she felt anything unusual about the house, but hesitated. Teresa was pragmatic to a fault and would likely dismiss my concerns as imagination. Instead, I merely nodded and thanked her as she departed. When I entered the sitting room, Mr. Bennet looked up from his recliner with his usual gentle smile. "Amelia, right on time as always," he said, turning down the volume on a documentary about deep-sea exploration. "How's that little girl of yours?" I told him about Grace's latest preschool art project as I settled into my usual chair, all while that persistent sense of foreboding continued to press against me. I scanned the room discreetly, looking for anything out of place. Nothing seemed unusual. Same furniture arrangement, same photographs on the mantel, same landscape paintings on the walls. Yet as we watched TV together, I couldn't shake the sensation of being observed. The feeling originated from the darkened hallway leading to the bedrooms. Every few minutes my eyes would dart involuntarily to the threshold, expecting to see something, someone, standing there in the shadows. Each time, there was nothing but empty darkness. When it came time to help Mr. Bennet to bed, I was relieved to move away from that hallway. As I assisted him with his evening routine, I asked casual questions about his day, listening carefully for any indication that he felt the same strangeness I did. He mentioned nothing unusual, though I noticed he seemed more tired than normal, the lines around his eyes deeper than I remembered. After settling him in bed, I began my usual security check of the house, a routine I'd performed hundreds of times before. I moved through each room methodically, securing windows, drawing blinds, checking door locks. The entire time, that weight of observation followed me, intensifying when I turned my back to darkened corners or open doorways. In the kitchen, I paused by the window that overlooked the backyard and adjacent woodlands. The night was clear, moonlight illuminating the yard and the first line of trees that marked the beginning of the forest. Nothing moved in the stillness, no wildlife, no rustling branches. The scene should have been peaceful, but instead it heightened my unease. I completed my rounds and returned to the guest room that served as my overnight quarters. The room was small but comfortable, containing a twin bed, nightstand, and reading chair. I texted Michael as I always did, checking on Grace and wishing them good night. Then, hesitating briefly, I added, "Something feels off about the house tonight. Can't explain it, but it feels like someone's watching me." His response came quickly. "It's all those true crime podcasts you listen to. Your imagination is working overtime. Try to get some sleep, babe." I wanted to believe he was right. I turned on a mindless comedy show on my tablet and tried to distract myself, but the sensation of being observed never diminished. Eventually, I opened the window beside the bed. The night was cool, and Mr. Bennet always kept the house uncomfortably warm. The fresh air provided momentary relief, but as I lay there in the dim light, I couldn't escape the feeling that something had entered the home, something that didn't belong. Shortly after midnight, Mr. Bennet's call button sounded. I hurried to his room, finding him sitting on the edge of his bed, looking disoriented. "Bathroom," he murmured, and I helped him up, supporting his weight as we shuffled to the adjacent bathroom. This was our third trip already, unusual for him. After helping him back to bed, I asked if he was feeling all right. "Just restless tonight," he replied, his voice sounding thinner than usual. "Can't seem to stay asleep." I adjusted his blankets and made sure his water glass was full before returning to my room. As I settled back onto my bed, I heard them, howls rising from the darkness outside. Growing up in rural New Hampshire, I was intimately familiar with coyote calls. The pack behind my childhood home had been a constant nocturnal presence, their yips and howls as familiar as the sound of crickets or wind in the pines. What I heard outside Mr. Bennet's window initially registered as coyotes, but something was profoundly wrong with the sound. The howls began distantly, seemingly from deep in the forest that bordered the property. They held the typical high-pitched, wavering quality of coyote calls, but with an underlying distortion, as if the sound was being filtered through something that changed its fundamental nature. Within minutes, the howling moved closer, unnaturally quickly, until it seemed to originate from directly beneath my window. What disturbed me most was the artificiality of the progression. Wild animals don't move in perfect measured increments of distance. Their movements are erratic, responsive to terrain and circumstance. These howls advanced with mechanical precision, like someone adjusting the volume knob on a recording. The sound quality itself was wrong too, hollow and slightly staticky, like an old tape recording played at slightly the wrong speed. I found myself thinking of those mysterious number stations that broadcast coded messages on shortwave radio, inhuman and deliberately distorted. I grabbed my phone and began recording, holding it toward the window where the sounds seemed strongest. The howling continued uninterrupted for 15 minutes straight, another unnatural behavior, as real coyotes typically call in briefer patterns with pauses between. When Mr. Bennett's call button sounded again, I almost welcomed the interruption. I paused my recording and hurried to his room. He was sitting fully upright in bed, looking toward his bedroom window with an expression of confused alarm. "Do you hear that?" he asked as I entered. "What is that racket?" "Coyotes," I said, though I was no longer convinced that's what we were hearing. "They sometimes get close to the house." "Never heard them like that before," he muttered, shaking his head. "Sounds wrong somehow." After helping him to the bathroom, I returned to my room and checked my phone to play back the recording. To my shock, the playback was completely silent. Not even background noise or room ambience had registered, despite the howling still continuing outside. I tried recording again with the same result. Nothing captured, though the sounds outside remained clearly audible to my ears. Shortly after 1 a.m., the howling stopped abruptly, mid-call, like someone had flipped a switch. The sudden silence was almost as unsettling as the sounds had been. Throughout the remainder of the night, Mr. Bennett called for assistance nearly a dozen times, far more than his usual pattern. Each time I entered his room, he appeared more exhausted, with a growing agitation evident in his movements and expression. By morning, dark circles had formed under his eyes, and his hands trembled slightly as he ate the breakfast I prepared. Neither of us mentioned the strange sounds again, as if by mutual unspoken agreement. When Teresa arrived to relieve me at 7 a.m., I briefly considered telling her about the unusual night, but decided against it. What could I say that wouldn't sound like the product of an overactive imagination or sleep deprivation? As I drove home in the morning light, I tried to rationalize what I'd experienced. Perhaps the coyotes had actually been someone playing a recording as a prank. Maybe the acoustics of the valley created strange effects with animal sounds. The inability to capture the sounds on my phone bothered me most. There should have been something, even if distorted. I arrived home physically and mentally drained. Michael was preparing to leave for work as I walked in, and Grace was still asleep. He kissed me goodbye, asking how my night had gone. "Fine," I lied, too exhausted to explain. "Just couldn't sleep much." Friday passed in a haze of fatigue. I napped when Grace did, but sleep brought little rest. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard those distorted howls. By evening, I had convinced myself that stress and an overactive imagination had magnified ordinary occurrences into something sinister. I wasn't scheduled to work again until Saturday night, and I hoped the break would reset my perspective. That evening, while Grace was engrossed in a cartoon and Michael was doing yard work, I opened my laptop and began researching. First, I looked up sound anomalies, ways that natural sounds could become distorted by environmental factors. I read about acoustic shadows, temperature inversions, and how certain geographical features could trap and alter sound waves. None seemed to explain what I'd heard. Next, I researched recording failures, wondering if electromagnetic interference could prevent my phone from capturing audio. This seemed plausible, though it wouldn't explain why the interference affected only the howling sounds and not ambient room noise. Almost reluctantly, I turned to less scientific explanations. I searched for folklore about mimicking creatures, skinwalkers from Native American traditions, and other entities known for imitating sounds to lure or frighten humans. The reservation lands surrounding Mr. Bennett's property belonged to the coastal Salish tribes, and I found myself reading about their traditional beliefs regarding forest spirits and boundary guardians. One particular story caught my attention, an account of spirits that would mimic familiar sounds to draw people into the forest. These entities were said to operate at thresholds and boundaries, particularly active during transitional times like dusk or dawn. They couldn't be captured in recordings or images, existing partially outside physical reality. I closed my laptop, uncomfortable with how closely these descriptions matched my experience. I wasn't typically superstitious, but the parallels were difficult to dismiss. That night I slept poorly despite being in my own bed with Michael beside me. I woke repeatedly, convinced I heard howling outside our apartment window, though we lived in a residential neighborhood, far from any wilderness areas. Saturday arrived, and with it, growing dread about returning to Mr. Bennett's home. By afternoon, my anxiety had intensified to the point that Michael noticed. "You've been checking the time every 5 minutes," he observed as we cleaned up after lunch. "What's going on?" I hesitated, then decided to tell him everything: the oppressive atmosphere in the house, the distorted howling, the recording failure, and Mr. Bennett's unusual restlessness. Michael listened without interrupting, his expression shifting from skepticism to concern as I spoke. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Have you considered not going back?" he finally asked. "You could call in sick, find a replacement." "I can't do that," I replied. "Mr. Bennett depends on me, and good overnight caregivers are hard to find on short notice. Besides..." I paused, struggling to articulate my reasoning. I need to know if it was real or if I was just overtired and imagining things. Michael didn't look convinced. "If you feel unsafe at any point, promise you'll call me." "I don't care what time it is," I promised, though I knew calling him would be a last resort. What could he do from miles away if something truly was wrong? As evening approached, I packed my overnight bag with extra care, including a small flashlight, a power bank for my phone, and, after some deliberation, a small container of salt. My grandmother had always kept salt by every door and window, claiming it created boundaries that certain energies couldn't cross. I felt slightly foolish including it, but decided there was no harm in having it available. Before leaving, I hugged Grace tightly, inhaling her familiar scent of baby shampoo and the faint sweetness that seemed inherent to all children. She wrapped her small arms around my neck, squeezing with surprising strength. "Be careful with the monsters, Mommy," she said as she released me. I froze. "What monsters, sweetie?" She shrugged, already turning back to her toys. "The ones that howl at night." I looked at Michael, who appeared equally startled. "Has she been having nightmares?" I asked quietly. He shook his head. "Not that I know of. Kids say weird things sometimes." I wanted to question Grace further, but it was time to leave for work. As I drove through the darkening evening toward Mr. Bennett's home, her words replayed in my mind. Children often have a sensitivity to things adults miss. Another piece of wisdom from my grandmother that I'd never fully believed until now. The weight of dread that met me at Mr. Bennett's door was even heavier than before. As I entered, the pressure against my chest made it difficult to take a full breath. The house appeared unchanged, yet somehow darker despite all the same lights being on. Shadows seemed to linger longer in corners, and the familiar spaces felt subtly wrong, as if someone had shifted every piece of furniture an inch to the left. Teresa greeted me in the kitchen, her professional demeanor momentarily slipping as she gathered her things. "Mr. Bennett had a rough day," she said, lowering her voice. "Barely ate, couldn't focus on his books or TV shows. Kept staring out the windows like he was looking for something. His daughter called earlier. She's worried about him." "Did he say anything about not sleeping well?" I asked. Teresa nodded. "Said he's been having trouble for a few nights now." I suggested he talk to his doctor about sleep medication, but you know how he feels about pills. She hesitated, then added, "He seems afraid of something." I asked him about it, but he just changed the subject. This information intensified my unease. If Mr. Bennett had been experiencing disturbances before Thursday night, then whatever was happening predated my awareness of it. I found him in his recliner as usual, but the difference in his appearance shocked me. In just 2 days, he seemed to have aged years. His skin had a grayish pallor, and the lines in his face had deepened. Most alarming were his eyes, normally bright and alert. They now appeared sunken and bordered by dark circles that spoke of profound exhaustion. "Good evening, Mr. Bennett," I said, trying to keep my voice light. "How are you feeling tonight?" He looked up at me and I saw recognition flicker in his eyes, followed by something else, relief, perhaps, or gratitude. "Amelia," he said, his voice raspier than usual. "Good to see you." We went through our evening routine, but everything felt mechanical and strained. Mr. Bennett barely spoke, responding to my questions with single words or nods. He showed no interest in the television program, instead repeatedly glancing toward the hallway with apprehension. When I suggested it might be time for bed, he tensed visibly but agreed. As I helped him prepare for sleep, I noticed he kept the bedside lamp on its brightest setting, something he'd never done before. When I reached to adjust it to the dimmer nighttime setting we typically used, he quickly placed his hand over mine. "Leave it bright," he said with unexpected firmness. "Please." I nodded and left it as it was. After ensuring he was settled, I performed my security check of the house, that sensation of being watched intensifying with each room I entered. The living room felt particularly oppressive, the shadows in the corners seeming to shift and deepen when viewed peripherally. In the kitchen, I paused again by the window overlooking the backyard. The night was cloudy, the forest beyond the yard a solid wall of darkness. As I stared into that darkness, I had the distinct impression that something stared back, something patient and aware. I completed my rounds and returned to my room, texting Michael to confirm I'd arrived safely. I deliberately kept my message casual, not wanting to worry him further. Then, despite the uncomfortably warm temperature in the house, I left my window closed. Whatever had produced those howls last night, I didn't want to invite it closer. For over an hour, I lay in bed scrolling mindlessly through social media, trying to distract myself from the heaviness in the air. Around midnight, Mr. Bennett's call button sounded. I found him sitting upright in bed, his eyes fixed on the far corner of the room. "I need to use the bathroom," he said, without looking at me. I helped him up, noting how his gaze remained locked on that empty corner until we left the room. After assisting him back to bed, I asked if he needed anything else. "Just stay a minute," he requested, still not meeting my eyes. I sat on the edge of the chair beside his bed. For several minutes, we remained in silence, the only sound the soft ticking of the analog clock on his nightstand. "Do you believe in evil, Amelia?" he finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The question caught me off guard. I suppose I do," I answered carefully, "though I think people use that word for a lot of different things." He nodded slowly. "There are things in this world that have no purpose except to cause harm, things that feed on fear and suffering." He finally turned to look at me, his eyes unnervingly clear despite his exhaustion. "I think something like that has found its way here." A chill ran through me. "What makes you say that, Mr. Bennett?" He was silent for so long I thought he might not answer. When he did, his voice had dropped even lower, forcing me to lean forward to hear him. "It started 4 nights ago. I woke up around 3 a.m. and saw someone standing at the foot of my bed, just a dark shape watching me. I thought it was you at first checking on me. I called out, but it didn't respond. When I reached for the lamp, it was gone." He paused, his fingers fidgeting with the edge of his blanket. "The next night it came back. Stood there longer. Last night it stayed for hours. Every hair on my body seemed to stand on end." "Have you told anyone else about this?" "Judith or Teresa." He shook his head. "They'd think I was losing my mind." "Maybe I am." His eyes drifted back to that corner of the room. "But I don't think so. It feels too real, too intentional." "What does it look like?" I asked, dreading the answer. "Just a shadow, deeper than the darkness around it. Man-shaped, but wrong somehow. Too tall, too thin. No features I can make out, but I can feel it watching me, studying me." His voice cracked slightly. "It wants something from me, Amelia. I don't know what, but I can feel its hunger." I struggled to find a response that wouldn't dismiss his experience while also not feeding his fear. "Have you been sleeping well otherwise? Sometimes exhaustion can cause our minds to play tricks on us." "I know what this sounds like," he replied, a hint of irritation in his tone. "I'm old, not senile. I know the difference between a dream and—" He trailed off, then added more softly, "It's here even when I'm wide awake." After a moment of uncomfortable silence, I assured him I would stay alert throughout the night and check on him frequently. This seemed to provide some comfort, and he settled back against his pillows, though his eyes remained fixed on that empty corner. I returned to my room deeply disturbed. Mr. Bennett was one of the most level-headed, practical people I knew. For him to speak of shadow figures and evil presences was wildly out of character. Yet his account aligned perfectly with the sensations I'd been experiencing, that feeling of being observed, the wrongness permeating the house. Around 1 a.m. the howling began again. This time it started much closer to the house, seemingly right outside in the yard. The same distorted mechanical quality pervaded the sound. But tonight there was a new element, rhythmic patterns that almost suggested language, as if something was attempting communication through the mimicry of animal calls. I tried recording again with the same result, perfect silence on playback. Frustrated, I pulled up the voice recorder on my phone and spoke directly into it. It's 1:17 a.m. on Saturday night. I'm hearing the howling sounds again outside Mr. Bennett's house. They sound like coyotes but distorted, almost artificial. The recording isn't picking them up for some reason. Mr. Bennett saw what he describes as a shadow figure at the foot of his bed for the past 3 nights. I've been feeling watched since I arrived Thursday. Something is wrong with this house. This time the recording captured my voice perfectly. At least I would have some record of what was happening, even if I couldn't document the sounds themselves. The howling continued for nearly 20 minutes before abruptly ceasing mid-call, just as it had the previous night. In the silence that followed, Mr. Bennett's call button sounded again. When I entered his room, he was pressed against his headboard, his eyes wide with terror, fixed on the foot of his bed. "It's here," he whispered, not looking at me. "Standing right there. Can't you see it?" I stared at the empty space he indicated, seeing nothing but the ordinary darkness of a nighttime bedroom. Yet as I focused on that area, the air seemed to thicken, and the familiar sensation of being watched intensified dramatically. "I don't see anything," I admitted, moving closer to his side. "But I believe you." And I did. In that moment, I was certain he wasn't hallucinating. He was perceiving something real that remained just beyond my visual range. "It's watching us both now," he said, his voice trembling. "It knows we're talking about it." A surge of protective anger cut through my fear. Whatever this thing was, it was terrorizing an elderly man who deserved peace in his final years. Remembering the salt in my bag, I excused myself and hurried back to my room. I returned with the small container and, feeling somewhat foolish but determined, began sprinkling a line of salt across the threshold of his bedroom door and along his windowsill. Mr. Bennett watched me with a mixture of confusion and hope. "What are you doing?" "An old family tradition," I explained, continuing my work. "Salt creates boundaries that certain energies can't cross." When I finished, I returned to his bedside. "Is it still there?" He stared at the foot of his bed for a long moment, then shook his head slowly. "It's gone. For now." I stayed with him until he fell into an uneasy sleep, then returned to my own room, leaving both our doors open so I could hear if he called out. For the remainder of the night, Mr. Bennett slept more peacefully than he had in days, waking only once more for a bathroom visit. I, however, didn't sleep at all. Every sound, the house settling, the refrigerator cycling on, the wind outside, seemed loaded with significance and potential threat. Twice I thought I heard scratching at my window, but when I looked, there was nothing visible in the darkness. When morning finally arrived, bringing with it the reassurance of daylight, I felt hollowed out by exhaustion and fear. Mr. Bennett looked marginally better after getting some actual rest, but the improvement was slight compared to the decline I'd witnessed over the past few days. As I prepared his breakfast, I made a decision. Whatever was happening in this house, I couldn't ignore it or pretend it was normal. Something was targeting Mr. Bennett, and whether it was supernatural or had a rational explanation, it was causing real harm to a vulnerable person in my care. I needed to take action. I didn't work again until Monday night, giving me Sunday to research and prepare. After discussing everything with Michael, who was now genuinely concerned rather than skeptical, I began gathering information and supplies. My grandmother had been knowledgeable about folklore and protection rituals from various traditions. While I'd always viewed her practices with affectionate skepticism, her confidence in them had never wavered. Now I found myself digging through boxes in our storage closet, searching for the notebook where I'd recorded her teachings after her death. I found it beneath old photo albums, a worn composition book filled with my hasty handwriting. Flipping through the pages, I found entries on house blessings, protection symbols, cleansing rituals, and guidelines for dealing with negative energies. Some seemed ridiculous, placing shoes upside down by the front door to confuse malevolent spirits, while others held the weight of ancient wisdom, the importance of clear intention in any protective act. One entry in particular caught my attention, a section on protective stones. According to my grandmother, certain crystals and minerals could absorb or repel negative energies. Black tourmaline was specifically mentioned as effective against entities that feed on fear or anxiety. The salt barrier I'd created for Mr. Bennett had seemed to provide temporary relief. Perhaps something more permanent might offer lasting protection. I spent Sunday afternoon visiting 3 different metaphysical shops before finding what I needed, a substantial piece of black tourmaline about the size of my palm. The shop owner, a gray-haired woman with kind eyes, asked what I planned to use it for. Protection, I said simply. She nodded, studying my face. For yourself? For an elderly client. He's been seeing things in his room at night. Her expression remained neutral, but she selected a different piece from her display case, larger and more structured than the one I'd chosen. This one has better energy for what you need, and you'll want to cleanse and charge it before placing it. She explained the process, washing the stone in salt water, allowing it to sit in direct sunlight or moonlight for several hours, and visualizing it filled with protective energy before placing it in the space I wanted to safeguard. I followed her instructions that afternoon, feeling self-conscious but determined. Michael watched without comment as I prepared the stone, though I could sense his skepticism. Grace, however, was fascinated by the process and insisted on helping me charge the tourmaline by holding it in the sunlight streaming through our window. "This will keep the monsters away," she declared with childish certainty. That evening, I called Judith, Mr. Bennett's daughter, explaining that I was concerned about her father's recent sleep disturbances and wanted her permission to try some alternative methods to help him rest better. I deliberately kept my explanation vague, focusing on his symptoms rather than possible causes. "Dad mentioned he hasn't been sleeping well," she confirmed. "I noticed how exhausted he looked when I visited last weekend." "If you think something might help, I trust your judgment, Amelia. You've always taken good care of him." With her blessing and the tourmaline prepared, I felt more confident about my plan. Still, as Monday evening approached, my anxiety intensified. What if Mr. Bennett's shadow visitor was simply a symptom of an undiagnosed medical condition? What if the protective measures failed? What if they worked, but whatever was targeting him simply turned its attention to me instead? I arrived at his house Monday night prepared for all possibilities. In addition to the tourmaline, I brought sage bundles for smudging, another of my grandmother's practices, holy water borrowed from a Catholic friend, and printed protection prayers from several different faith traditions. I felt slightly ridiculous with my arsenal of spiritual defenses, but the memory of Mr. Bennett's terrified expression kept me resolute. Teresa greeted me with evident relief. "He's been asking about you all day," she said as she gathered her things. "Keeps checking the clock, asking when you'd be arriving. I've never seen him so anxious about a caregiver change before." I found Mr. Bennett in his recliner as usual, but his posture was tense, his fingers gripping the armrests tightly. When he saw me, the relief on his face was palpable. "You're here," he said, exhaling slowly. "Good. I'm here," I confirmed, setting my bags down. "And I have some ideas that might help with your nighttime visitor." His eyes widened slightly. "You believe me, then?" "About what I'm seeing?" "I do," I said firmly. "And I think there are ways we can keep it away from you." For the first time in days, I saw a spark of hope in his expression. We went through our evening routine with a sense of purpose that had been missing during recent shifts. As I helped him prepare for bed, I explained what I planned to do. "I'm going to place some protective items around your room," I told him, "and perform a small ritual to cleanse the space. It might seem strange, but these practices have been used across many cultures for centuries to ward off negative energies." He nodded, watching intently as I removed the tourmaline from my bag. "My Caroline would have approved," he said quietly. She always said there were more things in this world than we could explain with science alone. I placed the tourmaline on the shelf above his bedroom doorway, positioned so it was directly over the entrance. Then, following my grandmother's instructions, I lit a sage bundle and moved slowly around the perimeter of the room, allowing the fragrant smoke to fill every corner while reciting a simple protection prayer. Mr. Bennett watched the process with solemn attention, occasionally closing his eyes as if in prayer himself. When I finished, the room smelled strongly of sage, the smoke having dissipated but its essence lingering in the air. "Do you think it will work?" he asked as I helped him into bed. "I hope so," I replied honestly. "But if it doesn't, we'll try something else. I won't leave you facing this alone." He reached out and squeezed my hand briefly, a gesture so uncharacteristic that it caught me by surprise. "Thank you, Amelia." I left his room with the door partially open, as had become our custom, and performed an abbreviated version of the cleansing ritual throughout the rest of the house. The oppressive atmosphere that had greeted me upon arrival seemed to lighten somewhat, though that could have been the power of suggestion. In my own room, I placed a smaller piece of tourmaline on the windowsill and sprinkled salt across the threshold, just as I had done for Mr. Bennett. Then I settled in to wait, alert for any sign of the howling or other disturbances. The night passed with unusual quiet. No howling came from the forest, and Mr. Bennett slept more soundly than he had in days, waking only twice for bathroom visits. During the second visit, around 3 a.m., he paused before returning to bed. "It hasn't come tonight," he said, his voice a mixture of relief and disbelief. "Not even a shadow at the edge of the room." "That's good," I replied, trying to contain my own surprise and relief. "Maybe it's decided to move on." He shook his head slowly. "I don't think it gives up that easily. But whatever you did, it's helping." I helped him back to bed, noting how much more relaxed his movements were compared to previous nights. As I returned to my own room, I felt cautiously optimistic. Perhaps the simple protective measures had been effective, or perhaps whatever had been targeting Mr. Bennett had indeed moved on. As I settled back into bed, a flicker of movement outside my window caught my attention. I moved closer to the glass, peering out into the darkness. The yard was illuminated by moonlight, the trees at its edge forming a wall of shadow. For a moment I saw nothing unusual. Then I noticed it. A tall, impossibly thin figure standing at the tree line, almost indistinguishable from the surrounding trunks except for its unnatural stillness. As I stared, trying to convince myself it was just a peculiarly shaped tree, it moved, a slight shift of position that no tree could make. I stepped back from the window, my heart pounding. For several minutes, I stood frozen in the center of the room, unsure whether to look again or pretend I'd seen nothing. Eventually, curiosity overcame fear, and I returned to the window. The figure was gone, but something else had appeared, markings in the frost that had formed on the outer glass. 3 vertical lines drawn through the condensation, 2 deliberately placed to be random condensation patterns or artifacts of freezing. I backed away from the window again, this time retrieving my phone to document what I'd seen. The camera captured the frost markings clearly, confirming they weren't a product of my imagination. I sent the image to Michael with the message, "Something is outside watching the house." His reply came quickly despite the hour. "Do you need me to come get you?" I considered the offer. Part of me desperately wanted to leave, to return to the safety of our apartment and familiar surroundings. But abandoning Mr. Bennett wasn't an option, not when he had finally found some relief from whatever had been terrorizing him. "No," I replied finally. "I think we're safe for now. It seems to be keeping its distance." I didn't sleep for the remainder of the night, keeping watch from a chair positioned so I could see both the window and the bedroom door. Nothing further appeared outside, and the frost markings eventually faded as the glass warmed. When morning arrived, I was exhausted but triumphant. Mr. Bennett looked noticeably better after a night of actual rest. Some color had returned to his face, and the tremor in his hands had diminished. As I prepared his breakfast, he asked if I would be returning that night. "Not tonight," I explained. "I'm scheduled for Thursday and Saturday this week." Concern flickered across his features. "Well, whatever you did last night, will it continue working when you're not here?" "I believe so," I said with more confidence than I felt. "The protection should remain in place regardless of who's in the house." He nodded, though I could see he wasn't entirely convinced. "If it comes back, I'll call Judith. Tell her I need you specifically." I left that morning with mixed emotions: relief that the protective measures seemed effective, concern about what might happen in my absence, and lingering unease about what I'd glimpsed outside the window. As I drove home in the brightening daylight, I tried to rationalize what I'd seen. Perhaps it had been a particularly tall, thin hiker stopping at the edge of the property. Perhaps the frost markings were simply condensation patterns that happened to look deliberate. But deep down, I knew better. Whatever had been targeting Mr. Bennett from inside his home had been forced outside by our protective measures, but it hadn't gone far. The next 2 days passed uneventfully. I caught up on sleep, spent time with Grace, and tried to process everything that had happened. Michael remained supportive but practical, suggesting I might consider finding a different client if the situation at Mr. Bennett's continued to disturb me. "I can't abandon him now," I explained. "Not when he's finally getting some relief. Besides, I need to know this is resolved before I walk away." On Thursday evening, I returned to Mr. Bennett's home with a mixture of apprehension and determination. The atmosphere that greeted me was noticeably lighter. The oppressive weight that had characterized my previous visits was diminished, though not entirely absent. Teresa reported that Mr. Bennett had been sleeping better according to the night caregivers who had covered Tuesday and Wednesday. "Whatever you did seems to be working," she said, gathering her things. "He's been more himself these past 2 days, more alert, better appetite, even started reading again." Mr. Bennett confirmed this improvement when I joined him in the living room. "That shadow hasn't returned," he told me, his voice stronger than it had been in days. "I still feel something in the house sometimes, but it stays in the hallway, doesn't come into my room anymore." This aligned with my own sensations. The feeling of being watched persisted, but it seemed more distant, as if observing from afar rather than looming immediately behind me. The house itself felt less corrupted, the familiar spaces reclaiming their ordinary character. Our evening routine proceeded normally, and Mr. Bennett went to bed without the terror that had marked previous nights. I checked the tourmaline above his doorway, finding it still securely in place, then performed a shorter version of the sage cleansing ritual as a precaution. After completing my security rounds, I settled into my room, texting Michael that everything seemed improved. I left my window closed despite the warmth of the house, unwilling to risk invitation to whatever might still be lingering outside. Around midnight, I heard a sound that made my blood freeze, howling from the forest, but different from before. Instead of the mechanical, distorted quality that had characterized the previous instances, this howling sounded authentically animal yet somehow performative, as if real coyotes were putting on a display specifically for human ears. I moved to my window cautiously, peering out into the moonlit yard. The tree line remained dark and seemingly empty, no sign of the tall figure I'd glimpsed before. The howling continued, rising and falling in patterns that still suggested communication rather than natural animal behavior. On impulse, I grabbed my phone and began recording. This time, to my surprise, the sounds registered on the playback, faint but unmistakably present. Whatever had prevented recording previously seemed to have weakened or changed tactics. Mr. Bennett slept through the howling, waking only once during the night for a bathroom visit. When I checked on him, he seemed peaceful, mentioning nothing about shadows or feelings of being watched. By morning, he looked remarkably improved. The haunted expression that had dominated his features for days had faded, replaced by his usual calm alertness. "I feel myself again," he said as we ate breakfast together. "Whatever was happening seems to be passing." I nodded, not wanting to alarm him with what I'd heard overnight. "The protection seems to be working," I said instead. "We should maintain it, just to be safe." That morning, as I prepared to leave, I performed a final check of the house. In the living room, I noticed something odd, a small black feather on the mantelpiece, precisely placed in the center as if deliberately positioned there. I was certain it hadn't been there the previous evening during my security rounds. I hesitated, then collected the feather using a tissue, placing it in a small plastic bag. It seemed important somehow, though I couldn't articulate why. As I drove home, I kept glancing at the bag on the passenger seat, half expecting the feather to have transformed into something else when I wasn't looking. It remained ordinary, Just a small black feather, possibly from a crow or raven. Saturday night marked my final shift of the week with Mr. Bennett. The house felt almost normal when I arrived. The residual sense of wrongness had faded to barely perceptible levels. Teresa reported that Mr. Bennett had continued improving, even mentioning to his daughter during her Friday visit that he was sleeping better than he had in weeks. Our evening proceeded routinely, with Mr. Bennett more talkative and engaged than he had been in days. As we watched a documentary about ocean exploration, he suddenly muted the television during a commercial break. "I need to ask you something, Amelia," he said, turning to face me fully. "What do you think was happening here?" "Really?" I considered my answer carefully. "I think something was targeting you, something that feeds on fear and exhaustion. I don't know exactly what it was, but I believe it was real, not imagined." He nodded slowly. "I've lived a practical life. Never gave much thought to things beyond what I could see and touch. But this," he shook his head, "this has changed how I see the world." "Not all changes in perspective are negative," I offered. "Sometimes they just expand our understanding." "True enough," he agreed, a hint of his usual thoughtfulness returning. "Caroline always said I was too rigid in my thinking. Perhaps she was right." That night passed peacefully. No howling, no disturbances, no calls from Mr. Bennett except for his routine bathroom visits. When I checked outside my window around 3 a.m., the yard and forest edge appeared normal, empty of any unnatural presences. In the morning, as I prepared to leave, Mr. Bennett called me into the living room where he sat in his favorite chair, a small wooden box in his hands. "I want you to have this," he said, extending the box toward me. "For everything you've done." I took it hesitantly. "That's not necessary, Mr. Bennett. I was just doing my job." "No," he said firmly. "You went far beyond your job. You believed me when others would have dismissed an old man's fears as confusion or dementia. You took action when professionals would have recommended medication to sedate me." He gestured to the box. "Please open it." Inside was a delicate silver pendant, a small circle containing what appeared to be a protection symbol, similar to those I'd seen in my grandmother's notebook. "It was Caroline's," he explained. "Her grandmother gave it to her, said it would keep her safe from harm. I never put much stock in such things before, but now," he smiled slightly, "now I think there might be something to it after all." I was deeply touched by the gesture. "Are you sure you want me to have this?" "Shouldn't it go to Judith?" He shook his head. "Judith has plenty of her mother's jewelry. This belongs with someone who understands its true purpose." I thanked him sincerely, placing the pendant around my neck. Its weight felt reassuring against my skin. As I prepared to leave, Mr. Bennett asked if I would continue as his caregiver. "I'd feel better knowing you're here, even if our unwelcome visitor seems to have departed." "Of course," I assured him. "I'm not going anywhere." In the weeks that followed, life at Mr. Bennett's home returned completely to normal. The oppressive atmosphere dissipated entirely, and no further unusual occurrences manifested. No shadow figures, no distorted howling, no frost markings on windows. Mr. Bennett regained his strength and mental clarity, returning to his books and hobbies with renewed interest. I maintained the protective measures as a precaution, refreshing the salt barriers and performing occasional cleansing rituals. The tourmaline remained in place above his bedroom doorway, a constant guardian against whatever had targeted him. We never spoke directly about those frightening nights again, as if by mutual agreement. Occasionally, Mr. Bennett would make an oblique reference, commenting on how well he was sleeping, or noting the peaceful quality of the house, but we avoided detailed discussions of what we had experienced. In quiet moments alone, I often contemplated what had actually happened. Was it possible that Mr. Bennett had experienced a brief psychotic episode triggered by exhaustion, which then influenced my own perceptions through the power of suggestion? Could the distorted howling have been a bizarre acoustic phenomenon specific to that geographical area? Might the figure I glimpsed at the forest edge have been a particularly tall hiker pausing at the property line? Each rational explanation I considered seemed plausible in isolation, yet utterly inadequate when contemplating the events as a whole. The recording discrepancies, the shadow Mr. Bennett described with such consistency, the markings on my window, these details resisted conventional explanations. I kept the feather I'd found on the mantelpiece, sealed in its plastic bag and stored in my desk drawer at home. Sometimes, late at night, I would take it out and examine it, searching for some clue to its significance. Under magnification, it appeared perfectly ordinary, just a feather from a common black bird. Yet its deliberate placement had suggested intention, a message of some kind that I couldn't decipher. The pendant Mr. Bennett gave me became a daily accessory, its weight against my skin a reminder of those strange, frightening nights and the bond forged through shared experience. Grace was fascinated by it, often asking to hold it and tracing its intricate design with her small fingers. "It keeps the monsters away," she would say with childish certainty, echoing her earlier comment about the tourmaline. I never corrected her. Perhaps in her innocent wisdom she understood more clearly than I did. Michael remained skeptical but supportive, never dismissing my experiences outright but gently suggesting alternative explanations. "Old houses make strange noises," he would offer. "Exhaustion can play tricks on the mind." His rational perspective provided balance to my increasingly expanded worldview, and I valued his grounding influence even when we disagreed. 3 months after those unsettling nights, I received a phone call from Judith. Mr. Bennett had suffered a stroke and been hospitalized. Though he survived the initial event, his condition deteriorated rapidly, and he passed away peacefully a week later, with Judith at his side. At his funeral, I wore the silver pendant, drawing comfort from its familiar weight. The service was small but dignified, reflecting the quiet, thoughtful man Mr. Bennett had been. As attendees shared memories afterward, Judith sought me out, taking my hands in hers. "Dad spoke of you often in his final months," she said. "Said you saved him from something dark that had found its way into his home?" She smiled sadly. "I thought he was being poetic about your excellent care, but there was something in his eyes when he talked about it, a certainty that made me wonder." I squeezed her hands gently. "Your father was an extraordinary man. It was a privilege to care for him." She nodded, then added more quietly, "Whatever happened in that house, whatever you did for him, thank you. He found peace in his final months because of you." I continue working as a private caregiver, though I'm more selective about my clients and assignments now. I pay attention to the feeling I get when entering a new home for the first time, trusting my instincts in ways I never did before. The silver pendant remains around my neck, a talisman against forces I once would have dismissed as superstition or imagination. Sometimes, driving past wooded areas at night, I catch myself listening for howls that sound wrong, distorted echoes of animal sounds carrying messages not meant for human understanding. Sometimes, in the moment between wakefulness and sleep, I imagine a tall, impossibly thin figure standing at the edge of my vision, watching and waiting. These moments no longer terrify me as they once did. Fear requires uncertainty, and I am no longer uncertain about what exists beyond the boundaries of conventional reality. There are presences in this world that defy explanation, entities that hunger for human suffering, that find pathways into vulnerable spaces and vulnerable minds. But there are also defenses against such intrusions, ancient practices carried through generations, protective boundaries reinforced by intention and belief. My grandmother understood this. Mr. Bennett came to understand it. And now so do I. Whatever watched us from the shadows that week has not returned, at least not in forms I can perceive. Perhaps it found easier prey elsewhere. Perhaps it retreated to whatever realm it originated from. Perhaps it still watches from a distance, waiting for protective measures to weaken or be forgotten. I maintain my vigilance either way, refreshing salt lines during full moons and carrying tourmaline in my pocket when working night shifts. I pay attention to the quality of darkness in unfamiliar spaces, to unexpected cold spots in otherwise warm rooms, to sounds that register to human ears but not to electronic devices. Most importantly, I listen when elderly clients speak of shadows at the foot of their beds or presences in empty rooms. I never dismiss these accounts as confusion or dementia. I know better now. There are watchers in the shadows of this world, patient, hungry entities that feed on fear and isolation. But they can be resisted, their influence diminished by protection rituals that span cultures and generations. The boundary between our reality and theirs is permeable but defensible. I am a 25-year-old female caregiver who has glimpsed what lies beyond that boundary. This is my testimony, my warning, and my reassurance. You are not imagining the watcher in the shadows, but you are not helpless against it either. was the autumn of 2019 when everything began. At 16 years old, I believed I understood the world around me. The dense population of the Netherlands, the carefully managed forests, the predictable rhythm of life in my small town near Utrecht. There was comfort in knowing that our wilderness was tamed, catalogued, and thoroughly explored. Unlike the vast wildernesses of North America or the uncharted depths of Siberia, nothing truly unknown could exist in our modest woodlands. My name is Lucas, and before I tell you what happened, I want to emphasize that what follows is entirely factual. I've spent countless hours since then researching possible explanations for what my friends and I experienced. The rational answers fall short. The woods near my home span approximately 35 square kilometers, modest by global standards, but the largest continuous forest in our vicinity. Growing up alongside these woods, I'd spent my childhood constructing elaborate fantasies within their borders, but by adolescence, I had relegated such imaginings to childish folly. Our town was unremarkable in most respects, a collection of brick houses, well-maintained bicycle lanes, and a single shopping district where elderly residents gathered to discuss the weather and local politics. Everyone knew everyone, which made our subsequent experiences all the more disturbing. In a place where anonymity was impossible, the unknown became particularly threatening. My parents worked long hours at the hospital, leaving me considerable freedom. I filled my days with school, cycling, and increasingly exploration with my friends. We were good students generally, which granted us liberties that more troublesome teenagers might have been denied. This perceived responsibility created the perfect cover for what would become our most reckless adventures. The trees in our forest stood like sentinels, primarily pine and spruce, with scattered deciduous varieties creating patches of diversity. During daylight, sunlight filtered through branches in golden shafts, illuminating particles of dust and pollen. At night, however, the same trees transformed into looming shadows, their familiar forms warping into threatening silhouettes against the starlit sky. It was in this nocturnal transformation that we found our earliest thrills, before genuine fear introduced itself to our lives. Remember the precise moment when our innocent explorations shifted toward something darker. It was during a mathematics lesson when our teacher announced the arrival of a new student. Just stood at the front of the classroom, tall and confident, with an intensity that immediately captured our attention. He didn't smile much, but when he did, it conveyed a knowledge of exciting possibilities beyond our current experience. Just's family had moved into the last house on Bosveld Lane, a property that literally marked the boundary between civilization and wilderness. Their land was expansive by Dutch standards, nearly 2 hectares, with the main house, a detached guest cottage, and a converted barn that served as his father's architectural studio. But what interested us most was what lay just beyond their property line. 4 abandoned structures, remnants of what had once been a small forestry outpost established in the 1950s. Within weeks of his arrival, Joost had integrated himself into our friend group. Besides myself, there was Willem, whose hearing impairment from a childhood illness had made him exceptionally observant in other ways. Martin, whose father's construction business provided access to tools and knowledge we would later put to troubling use, and Joost, whose boundary-testing nature would ultimately lead us into the darkness. "You should see these old buildings," Joost told us during lunch one day. "They've been abandoned for years. Nobody cares about them." That weekend, we gathered at Joost's house for what his parents believed was a gaming session. His mother, a kind woman with tired eyes, brought us snacks and reminded us not to stay up too late. We waited until midnight when the lights in the main house went dark, before slipping out through the guest cottage's rear entrance. The abandoned property lay approximately 300 meters beyond Joost's land, accessible through a barely visible trail worn by decades of occasional foot traffic. Joost led with his phone's flashlight, while I brought up the rear, constantly glancing backward into the darkness behind us. The forest at night transformed familiar terrain into an alien landscape. Ordinary branches became grasping hands. Routine animal sounds took on sinister significance. "My father says these buildings will be demolished next year," Joost whispered as we approached. "Some developer bought the land." The structures materialized from the darkness. A concrete utility shed nearest to the trail, and beyond it, 3 larger buildings arranged in a rough semicircle. 2 had partially collapsed roofs, The third, the smallest, remained largely intact. The broken windows resembled jagged teeth in skeletal faces. Years of neglect had transformed what must have been utilitarian structures into something more ominous. Willem moved toward the intact building. "What was this place for?" "Forest management," Just replied. "They monitored for fires, tracked wildlife, that sort of thing. It was abandoned in the 1980s when they centralized operations in Arnhem. We explored cautiously that first night, testing floorboards before committing our weight, avoiding the more precarious sections. In the small intact building, dust covered everything. A desk, a broken chair, empty filing cabinets. It felt as though someone had simply walked away one day, leaving everything behind. "We should make this our place," Martin suggested, his voice echoing slightly in the empty room. "Nobody else comes here." None of us realized then that we were establishing a pattern that would lead us toward experiences none of us could explain or forget. That night was innocent enough. We explored, we told stories, we experienced the peculiar thrill of occupying a forbidden space. We returned to Just's cottage before dawn, exhilarated by our minor rebellion and already planning our return. What began as exploration evolved into something more concerning over subsequent months. Our visits increased in frequency and duration. The abandoned property became our laboratory for increasingly destructive experiments. First, it was smashing the few remaining intact windows, then breaking the furniture we found inside. By early December, we had graduated to testing homemade explosive devices, combinations of household chemicals and fireworks that produce satisfying, if dangerous, results. We named these excursions Chaos Nights, and they followed a predictable pattern. We would gather at Just's guest cottage, wait until his parents were asleep, then venture out with backpacks full of contraband, alcohol stolen from our parents' cabinets, fireworks purchased illegally from classmates, tools borrowed without permission from Martin's father's workshop. The pine forest surrounding the abandoned property contained several sandy clearings, remnants of ancient glacial deposits that provided perfect staging grounds for our more incendiary activities. The largest of these clearings lay approximately 5 kilometers from Just's house, requiring an hour's hike through increasingly dense forest. It was roughly circular, perhaps 30 meters in diameter, and devoid of vegetation except for sparse tufts of hardy grass along its perimeter. During our 5th Chaos Night, in late December 2019, we constructed crude incendiary devices from glass bottles filled with gasoline and motor oil, with fabric wicks protruding through cork stoppers. We called them Molotovs, though they were inefficient approximations of the real thing. The temperature had dropped below freezing, and our breath formed clouds in the beam of our flashlights. "This is where the real fun begins," Just announced, holding a bottle aloft. "We'll start with the concrete shed." The shed was the safest place for such experiments. Its poured concrete construction resistant to fire, its location separated from the more flammable wooden structures by several meters of cleared ground. Willem stood watch at the trail entrance while Martin readied a camera to document our vandalism. The first bottle shattered against the interior wall of the shed, spreading flames in a brief but impressive display. The fire consumed the accelerant quickly, leaving scorched concrete but causing no real damage. We cheered at the spectacle, our voices unnaturally loud in the winter silence. We spent hours throwing our homemade weapons, competing to create the most impressive explosion, the tallest flames. Time seemed suspended in our reckless entertainment, the real world and its consequences impossibly distant. None of us noticed the gradual change in atmosphere until Just paused, bottle in hand, and tilted his head. "Do you hear that?" he asked. We fell silent, straining to listen. Initially, I heard nothing beyond the normal forest sounds, the whisper of wind through pine needles, the occasional crack of a branch contracting in the cold. Then, faintly, something else, a rhythm that didn't belong, subtle but persistent. "Probably just the wind," Martin suggested, but his voice lacked conviction. "No," Just insisted. "It sounds like breathing." We listened again. The sound remained just at the threshold of perception, present but impossible to locate. It seemed to come from all directions simultaneously, a soft inhalation and exhalation that mimicked human respiration but somehow wasn't quite right. Too measured, too deliberate. Someone's watching us, Willem concluded, his eyes scanning the tree line. We should go. We left our remaining supplies and retreated toward Just's house, moving quickly through the forest. The sensation of being observed persisted, raising the hair on my arms despite my layers of winter clothing. None of us spoke until we reached the safety of the guest cottage. Probably just forest rangers, Martin suggested as we closed the door behind us. They must patrol sometimes. At 3 a.m? Jost countered. In freezing temperatures? We didn't return to the forest that night, but our experience, rather than deterring us, only intensified our fascination. Something about the forbidden, the potentially dangerous, drew us back repeatedly. We were playing with fire in more ways than one. Our most disturbing chaos night occurred in early January 2020. The holiday period had separated us. Martin had traveled with his family to visit relatives in Belgium, leaving just Just, Willem, and me to maintain our ritual. The temperature had plummeted further, freezing the ground solid and creating a crystalline landscape that crunched beneath our boots. We had planned a pre-dawn expedition to the largest sandy clearing for a special display, 15 liters of lighter fluid arranged in an elaborate pattern that would create a momentary but spectacular fire design when ignited. The container was heavy, requiring us to take turns carrying it as we navigated the forest path. We walked in single file, Willem leading, then Just, with me bringing up the rear. Frost had transformed the forest into a glittering otherworld, beautiful but alien. Our breath formed clouds that lingered in the still air before dissolving into nothingness. The moon was nearly full, casting blue-white light through the canopy and eliminating the need for flashlights along the more open sections of trail. We were approximately 2 kilometers from our destination when I heard it. A woman's voice, soft but distinct, no more than 3 meters to my right among the trees. The words were indecipherable, a continuous whispered monologue that contained the rhythms and patterns of human speech but remained just beyond comprehension. I stopped abruptly, nearly causing Just to collide with me as he turned to see why I'd halted. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. Just's eyes widened. He nodded slowly, turning toward the source of the sound. Willem continued forward for several paces before realizing we had stopped. "What's wrong?" he called back. "There's someone out there," Just replied, his voice barely audible. "A woman, I think." Willem rejoined us, squinting in the direction we were facing. "I don't hear anything," he said, which wasn't surprising given his hearing impairment. The whispering continued, maintaining a consistent volume regardless of the silence we now held. It wasn't the wind, the night was still. It wasn't an animal. The cadence was unmistakably human. Yet something about it raised primal alarms in my mind. I unclipped my flashlight and directed its beam toward the sound. The light revealed only trees, undergrowth, the ordinary features of the forest. Nothing moved. Nothing changed. Yet the whispering continued, now seeming to come from a slightly different direction, as though the speaker had shifted position without making a sound of movement. "Hello?" Just called, his voice cracking slightly. "Is someone there?" The whispering stopped immediately. The silence that followed was absolute. No wind, no distant animal sounds, nothing. Then, from significantly closer than before, it resumed. This time I could almost make out words, almost grasp the meaning that hovered just beyond understanding. The voice had a quality I still struggle to describe, simultaneously young and ancient, intimate yet utterly foreign. Willem, seeing our expressions, reached for his own flashlight. "What is it? What do you hear?" "It's right there," I said, pointing with my light. "Can't you see anything?" But there was nothing to see. The forest remained empty of human presence besides our own. The mathematical impossibility struck me then. The population density of the Netherlands, the proximity to settlements, the improbability of someone else being in this specific location at 4:30 in the morning in freezing January temperatures. Yet the whispering was undeniable. Just took an involuntary step backward. We should go. For once I agreed completely. We abandoned our plan, turned around, and walked rapidly back toward Just's house. The whispering didn't follow us. It remained localized to that particular section of forest, but the memory of it certainly did. That night, safe in the guest cottage, we rationalized. Perhaps it was an environmental researcher, someone monitoring wildlife. Perhaps it was another group of teenagers with their own version of chaos night. Perhaps it was nothing more than an unusual acoustic phenomenon. None of these explanations satisfied us, but they allowed us to sleep. Barely. Our encounter with the whispering voice temporarily dampened our enthusiasm for nocturnal forest adventures. For 2 weeks, we limited our activities to video games and movies at Eust's guest cottage, venturing outside only during daylight hours and staying well clear of the deeper forest. By late January, however, our adolescent sense of invulnerability had reasserted itself. Martin had returned from Belgium, bringing stories of his own adventures that rekindled our competitive spirit. We planned another expedition, this time back to the abandoned buildings rather than the distant clearing. We never really explored the main buildings properly, Eust pointed out as we prepared our backpacks. Just the concrete shed. The roofs looked unstable, I reminded him. It might not be safe. Only 2 of them, Martin countered. The small one seemed solid enough. And so, on a slightly warmer night in late January, we returned to the abandoned forestry outpost. Our primary objective was to perfect our Molotov technique in the concrete shed, but curiosity about the other structures had been building. The 4 of us arrived shortly after midnight, our path illuminated by the waning moon and our flashlights. The concrete shed appeared exactly as we had left it, scorch marks on the interior walls, the only evidence of our previous visits. We spent nearly an hour there, testing improved accelerant mixtures and documenting the results on Martin's camera. The activity restored our confidence, pushing the memory of the whispering voice further into the background of our consciousness. As our supply of bottles dwindled, Juice suggested we investigate the small intact building while we still had energy and courage. We approached cautiously, testing each step on the wooden porch that fronted the structure. Unlike our previous brief exploration, this time we intended a more thorough investigation. The front door hung partially off its hinges, creating an opening just wide enough for us to enter single file. The interior was much as we remembered: dust-covered desk, broken chair, empty filing cabinets. But in the illumination of our 4 flashlights, new details emerged that we had previously overlooked. The walls, which I had assumed were simply dirty from decades of neglect, were actually covered with faded markings in red paint or perhaps ink. Most were concentrated on the wall opposite the entrance, arranged in patterns that suggested deliberate placement rather than random graffiti. "What is this?" Willem asked, directing his beam at the largest symbol, a triangle containing a crude representation of an eye with what appeared to be a teardrop beneath it. "Probably just teenagers like us," Martin suggested, but his tone conveyed doubt. Juice moved closer to the wall, examining the markings. "These aren't recent," he observed. "Look how the color has faded into the wood. These have been here for years." Surrounding the triangular eye were other symbols, concentric circles, spiraling lines, and geometric shapes that reminded me of crop circle photographs I'd seen online. Most disturbing was the realization that these markings continued across all 4 walls, creating a continuous band of symbology that encircled the room. "Check this out," Willem called. He had moved further into the building and was indicating a section of floor that had been cleared of dust in a perfect circle, approximately 2 meters in diameter. Around the perimeter of this circle were the melted remnants of candles, dozens of them, spaced at regular intervals. "This is recent," Willem continued, crouching to examine the floor more closely. "There's almost no dust inside this circle." A coldness that had nothing to do with the January temperature settled in my stomach. Someone had been using this abandoned building, and not for the childish, destructive play that characterized our own visits. This was organized, purposeful, and thoroughly unsettling. "There's another room," Eust announced, pointing his light toward a doorway at the rear of the main space. The second room was smaller and lacked windows entirely, creating a sealed environment that somehow felt more disturbing than the main area. Here, the symbolic markings were more concentrated, more elaborate, and centered around another triangular eye painted directly opposite the doorway. This one was significantly larger, perhaps a meter in height, and rendered with greater detail than those in the outer room. Martin approached the eye symbol, his flashlight revealing specks of red that appeared fresher than the surrounding markings. "Is this recent?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Before anyone could answer, Willem called our attention to the center of the room. "Guys, look at this." In the center of another cleared circle lay an object none of us immediately recognized. It resembled a medieval weapon, a wooden handle approximately 60 centimeters long, attached to a chain that culminated in a metal ball studded with sharpened nails or spikes. "It's a morning star," Just identified. "A homemade one." "Who would make something like this?" I asked, the question directed more at the universe than my friends. Martin moved to pick up the weapon, but Just caught his arm. "Don't touch it," he warned. "We don't know why it's here." Something caught my eye near the ceiling, a small window I hadn't initially noticed, approximately 20 centimeters square. Through this aperture, moonlight illuminated another triangular eye symbol painted directly beneath the window, creating the unsettling impression that the symbol was watching us through this tiny opening. "I think we should leave," I suggested, suddenly aware of how isolated we were, how vulnerable. Martin ignored my suggestion and Just's warning, reaching down to lift the morning star from its position. "This is incredible craftsmanship," he observed, testing the weight of the weapon. "Someone spent a lot of time making this." Willem had discovered something else, a spherical white object that resembled a lamp globe. He held it up to his flashlight, casting strange patterns across the room as the light refracted through the translucent material. "The Eye of the Illuminati," he joked, his voice too loud in the confines of the small room. He tossed the globe into the air, catching it and repeating the action several times. "Be careful with that," I cautioned, but my warning came too late. On his next toss, Willem miscalculated. The globe sailed past his outstretched hands and shattered against the floor, fragments skittering across the wooden planks. The sound was explosive in the midnight silence, and we all froze, as though expecting immediate consequences. When nothing happened, nervous laughter broke the tension. Martin continued examining the morning star while Just photographed the symbols with his phone. I found myself drawn to the small window, peering out into the darkness beyond. The forest appeared normal, trees swaying slightly in a breeze that had arisen, moonlight creating patches of silver among the shadows. Then something moved at the edge of my vision. Not the trees, not an animal, but something larger, darker, momentarily blocking the moonlight before disappearing behind a thick pine trunk. My heart rate accelerated instantly. "Someone's out there," I whispered, backing away from the window. "Probably just a deer," Just replied, not looking up from his photography. "It was walking upright," I insisted. This caught their attention. All activity ceased as my three friends turned toward me, expressions ranging from skepticism to alarm. "Are you sure?" Willem asked. I wasn't sure of anything anymore. The combination of the bizarre symbols, the homemade weapon, and now possibly a human observer had overwhelmed my capacity for rational assessment. I wanted desperately to leave, to return to the safety of Just's guest cottage and the familiar world of video games and snack foods. "Let's just go," I pleaded. "This place feels wrong." To my relief, no one argued. We gathered our remaining supplies, and Martin decided to take the morning star with us. A decision I questioned but lacked the courage to oppose. As we exited the building, I couldn't shake the sensation of being observed. Not just by human eyes, but by something represented in those disturbing triangular symbols. The return journey passed in tense silence, each of us processing what we had discovered. The morning star now resided in Just's shed, hidden beneath a tarpaulin covering his father's gardening equipment. None of us mentioned returning to the forest or the abandoned buildings that night. Some boundaries, once crossed, fundamentally alter your relationship with the world around you. In the days following our discovery of the symbols and the morning star, an unspoken agreement kept us away from the forest. We gathered at Just's house as usual, but limited our activities to normal teenage pursuits. None of us explicitly referenced what we had seen, yet it dominated our thoughts, evidenced by the frequent lulls in conversation and distant gazes. Unable to contain my curiosity, I began researching the symbols we had found. The triangular eye was easily identifiable, a variation of the all-seeing eye, or Eye of Providence, commonly associated with Freemasonry and various conspiracy theories. The surrounding symbols proved more difficult to classify, resembling elements from multiple esoteric traditions without conforming precisely to any single one. 1 week after our discovery, I invited the others to my house to share what I had learned. My parents were working overnight shifts at the hospital, giving us privacy for a conversation we all recognized as necessary but had been avoiding. The eye symbol is pretty common, I explained, showing them printouts from my research. It appears in all kinds of contexts, religious, occult, even on the American dollar bill. But the specific variation we saw with the teardrop is less common. What does the tear mean? Willem asked. That's harder to pin down. In some interpretations it represents sorrow for human suffering. In others it's linked to sacrifice or offering. Martin picked up one of the printouts, examining it closely. And the circle of candles? Classic ritual space definition, I replied, trying to sound more knowledgeable than I felt. Creating a sacred circle is fundamental to various magical practices. It's supposed to contain energy or keep unwanted influences out or in, depending on the purpose. Joost had been uncharacteristically quiet. Now he spoke, his voice subdued. Have you found anything about why someone would leave a weapon in the middle of such a circle? I shook my head. Nothing specific. Weapons can be used as ritual objects in some traditions, but a morning star is unusual. It's a particularly violent weapon, designed specifically to cause maximum damage to opponents. Could it be some kind of offering? Willem suggested. Possibly, I conceded. Or a tool for something specific. Like what? Martin pressed. I hesitated, reluctant to voice the darker possibilities my research had suggested. Some rituals are meant to open doorways, I suppose you could say, to establish communication with entities beyond normal perception. You mean like ghosts? Spirits? Willem's tone was skeptical, but his expression betrayed unease. Or something else entirely, I replied. The literature is full of references to beings that exist alongside us, but remain imperceptible under normal circumstances. Different traditions have different names for them. This is ridiculous, Martin declared, though his forceful tone seemed designed to convince himself as much as us. It's obviously just some role-playing game that other teenagers set up, like Dungeons and Dragons in real life. That doesn't explain the whispering, Joost countered, or what Lucas saw outside the window. I could have been mistaken, I admitted. It was dark and we were all on edge. But the whispering wasn't imagination, Joost insisted. We both heard it, Lucas. It was real. We fell silent, contemplating the implications. The comfortable rationality of our world had developed cracks, revealing glimpses of something else behind the facade of ordinary reality. None of us were prepared to fully embrace supernatural explanations, yet the conventional alternatives seemed increasingly inadequate. I think we should go back, Joost finally suggested. During the day, we can document everything properly, take samples of the red pigment, maybe figure out how long ago the symbols were painted. What about the whispering? Willem asked. What if whoever, or whatever, made those symbols is still using that part of the forest? All the more reason to investigate while it's light, Joost argued. We can bring more people if you're worried. Safety in numbers. The suggestion awakened conflicting impulses, curiosity versus caution, the desire for answers versus the instinct for self-preservation. Before we could reach a decision, a notification chimed on Joost's phone. It's my dad, he announced, reading the message. There's been a development with the abandoned property. The demolition is happening earlier than planned, starting tomorrow. Tomorrow? Martin repeated. Why the rush? Apparently there have been complaints from hikers about suspicious activity in the area. The property owner decided to accelerate the timeline to prevent liability issues. The news created a new urgency. Whatever answers might be found in those buildings would soon be lost forever, buried under rubble or carted away to landfills. Our window of opportunity was closing rapidly. We have to go tonight, Willem declared, surprising us all with his decisiveness. It's our last chance. Reluctantly, I found myself agreeing. For all the fear those buildings had inspired, the prospect of never understanding what we had encountered was somehow worse. The mystery would remain unresolved, haunting us with possibilities rather than conclusions. Tonight, then, Joost confirmed. But we approach this differently. No Molotovs, no destructive behavior. We document everything methodically. Photographs, measurements, samples of the red substance. We treat it like a research expedition, not a chaos night. We agreed to meet at Joost's guest cottage at 11 p.m. allowing us to reach the abandoned property by midnight. As my friends departed to prepare, I remained haunted by the whispering voice and what might await us in the forest darkness. Some questions, I was beginning to suspect, were better left unanswered. We gathered at Eust's guest cottage as planned, our backpacks containing cameras, specimen containers, measuring tape, notepads, and other tools of improvised investigation. The night was overcast, the moon and stars obscured by a thick layer of clouds that had moved in during the evening. The resulting darkness seemed appropriate for what might be our final expedition to the abandoned property. The demolition crew arrives at 7 a.m., Eust informed us as we prepared to depart. We need to be clear of the area well before then. We set out at 11:30 p.m., following our familiar path through the forest. The absence of moonlight necessitated constant use of our flashlights, the beams creating tunnels of visibility that emphasized how little we could actually see of our surroundings. The forest felt different this night, the shadows deeper, the silence more complete. Even the ambient sounds of wildlife seemed muted, as though the woodland creatures had withdrawn from our vicinity. No one spoke as we walked. Each of us was absorbed in private thoughts, anticipations, and fears. The weight of our previous experiences hung over us, tempering the adolescent bravado that had characterized our earlier adventures. We were no longer just teenagers seeking thrills. We had become reluctant investigators of something we didn't understand but couldn't ignore. As we approached the final stretch of trail leading to the abandoned property, Jost raised his hand, signaling us to stop. He extinguished his flashlight and gestured for us to do the same. In the sudden darkness, he leaned close to whisper, "There's light ahead." Someone's there. He was right. Through the trees, approximately 200 meters distant, a faint glow emanated from the direction of the abandoned buildings. Not the bright, steady illumination of electric lights or work lamps, but the flickering, organic light of flames, perhaps candles or small oil lamps. "What do we do?" Willem whispered. "We watch," Eust decided. "Carefully. We need to know who's using these buildings." We advanced slowly, moving from tree to tree, minimizing noise by testing each step before committing our weight. As we drew closer, the source of the light became clear, the small intact building where we had discovered the symbols and the morning star. Light spilled from its windows and the partially open door, creating pools of illumination on the surrounding ground. We positioned ourselves behind a dense cluster of pine trees approximately 50 meters from the building, close enough to observe but far enough to remain undetected. From this vantage point, we could see movement within the structure, at least 3 distinct shadows passing before the windows. "People," Martin whispered, his voice containing equal measures of relief and disappointment. "Just people. But what are they doing?" I countered. As if in answer to my question, a figure emerged from the building. In the dim light, details were difficult to discern, but it appeared to be a man of average height wearing dark clothing. He carried something in his hands, an object that caught the light as he moved, revealing a metallic surface. The morning star. Our morning star. The realization struck us simultaneously. The weapon Martin had removed and Eust had hidden had somehow been returned to its original location. Either someone had found it in Eust's shed, highly unlikely given its concealment, or this was a second identical weapon. The figure placed the morning star on the ground and retreated into the building. Moments later, he emerged again, accompanied by 2 others. All 3 were dressed similarly in dark clothing, their faces indistinct in the limited light. They arranged themselves around the building in a triangular formation, each position seemingly predetermined and significant. "They're performing some kind of ritual," Willem whispered, stating what had become obvious to all of us. From within the building came a new sound, a rhythmic chanting in multiple voices, the words unfamiliar but the cadence measured and deliberate. The 3 figures outside remained motionless in their positions, creating a perimeter around the structure. Then came a sound that froze my blood, a woman's voice, whispering in the same incomprehensible manner we had heard in the forest. Not from the building or the 3 figures, but from somewhere in the darkness to our right. The same voice, unmistakably. Jost gripped my arm, his fingers digging painfully into my flesh. His wide eyes confirmed that he heard it too. Willem and Martin, positioned slightly further away, appeared oblivious to this particular sound. their attention fixed on the ritual unfolding before us. The whispering intensified, gathering urgency and volume while remaining just as unintelligible as before. It seemed to be responding to the chanting from the building, creating a disturbing counterpoint that raised goosebumps along my arms despite the mild temperature. One of the figures near the building turned suddenly, facing directly toward our hiding place. Though I couldn't make out his features, I felt with absolute certainty that he was looking at us, not just in our general direction, but directly at me specifically. He raised one arm, pointing toward our position with unmistakable purpose. "Run!" Just hissed, already backing away. Now, we abandoned all pretense of stealth, turning and sprinting back down the trail toward Just's property. Branches whipped against our faces. Roots threatened to trip us in the darkness. Yet fear propelled us forward with unnatural speed and coordination. Behind us, voices shouted, human voices angry and urgent. Flashlight beams cut through the forest, searching. The whispering had ceased, replaced by the sounds of pursuit, cracking branches, rustling undergrowth, labored breathing. We reached Just's property in record time, bursting through the tree line and across the open lawn toward the guest cottage. Only when we were inside with the door locked and curtains drawn did we collapse, gasping for breath, our hearts pounding in synchronized terror. "They saw us," Martin panted. "They know who we are." "They don't," Just countered, though his voice lacked conviction. It was too dark. They couldn't have seen our faces. "What were they doing?" Willem asked, his voice higher than normal. "What kind of ritual involves a medieval weapon and all those symbols?" I had no answers, only questions that multiplied with each passing moment. Who were these people? How long had they been using the abandoned buildings? What was the significance of the triangular eye symbols and the morning star? And most disturbing of all, what was the source of the whispering voice that seemed connected to their activities yet separate from them? We spent the remainder of the night in the guest cottage, lights on, occasionally peering through the curtains at the dark forest beyond Just's property line. No one followed us. No one approached the house. By dawn, exhaustion had overtaken fear, and we drifted into uneasy sleep as the first demolition vehicles rumbled down the road toward the abandoned property. The abandoned buildings were demolished as scheduled. By noon the following day, nothing remained but concrete foundations and scattered debris awaiting removal. We observed from a distance as heavy machinery completed the destruction, each of us silently processing the knowledge that physical evidence of what we had witnessed was disappearing forever. In the weeks that followed, we maintained an unspoken agreement to avoid the forest entirely, our gatherings relocated to my house or Martin's, our activities returning to the ordinary pursuits of Dutch teenagers, studying, video games, discussions about music and future plans. On the surface, life normalized. Beneath that surface, something had fundamentally changed. Sleep became problematic for me. When I did manage to drift off, my dreams were populated by triangular symbols with weeping eyes and formless whispers that pursued me through endless forests. I found myself researching occult symbolism with increasing obsession, seeking patterns that might explain what we had encountered. 1 month after the demolition, Just invited us to his house. His parents were traveling, leaving us the privacy needed for the conversation we had been avoiding. "I need to show you something," he announced once we had gathered in the guest cottage. He retrieved his laptop and opened a video file. "This is from my father's security camera. It's positioned at the edge of our property, facing toward where the abandoned building stood." The timestamp on the video indicated it had been recorded 3 nights earlier. For several minutes, nothing happened, just the ordinary nocturnal landscape, occasionally disturbed by wind or small animals. Then, at 2:43 a.m., a figure appeared at the edge of the frame, moving with deliberate purpose toward the camera. As the figure drew closer, details became clearer. It was a woman, though her features remained indistinct due to the camera's limited resolution. She wore what appeared to be light-colored clothing that seemed to shimmer slightly in the infrared illumination of the security system. "Watch this," Just instructed. His voice tight. The woman stopped approximately 10 meters from the camera. For nearly a minute, she remained motionless, seemingly staring directly into the lens. Then her lips began to move. Though the video contained no audio, the movement was unmistakable. She was speaking, or more accurately, whispering. "Is that—" Willem began. "I think so," Just confirmed. The same voice we heard in the forest. The woman's whispering continued for precisely 2 minutes and 17 seconds. Then, without warning or transition, she was simply gone. Not walking away, not fading gradually, present in one frame, absent in the next. That's impossible, Martin declared, leaning closer to the screen. Play it again. Just complied, advancing frame by frame through the moment of disappearance. There was no technical glitch, no jump in the recording. One moment the woman was there. The next she wasn't. This doesn't prove anything supernatural, Martin insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. It could be video manipulation or a camera malfunction. My father's security system is professional grade, Just countered. And why would anyone bother faking something like this? I had been silent, processing what I had seen. Now I spoke, giving voice to the question that troubled me most. What if she's still out there? What if whatever ritual those people were performing actually accomplished something? Accomplished what? Willem demanded. I don't know, I admitted. But in most traditions, rituals involving specific symbols, specific locations, and specific tools are meant to establish communication or connection with something else. Something not usually accessible. You mean like summoning? Martin's tone was skeptical, but his expression betrayed genuine concern. Or creating a doorway, I suggested. The Dutch folklore about the forests has always included stories about boundaries between worlds growing thin in certain locations under certain conditions. Those are just stories, Willem protested. Fairy tales to explain natural phenomena people didn't understand. Maybe, I conceded. Or maybe they were warnings based on actual experiences, preserved through generations in the form of folk tales. Just closed his laptop, his expression grave. Whatever the explanation, I don't think we've seen the last of this. The buildings are gone, but the forest remains. And so does she, apparently. In the years since that conversation, we have maintained our distance from the forest. Our chaos nights have ended, replaced by more conventional teenage activities. We've never discussed what happened with anyone outside our small group, knowing that the story would sound like adolescent fantasy or fabrication. Yet occasionally, when the wind blows from the direction of the forest, I find myself listening for whispers among the natural sounds. Sometimes, walking home after dark, I sense eyes watching from the shadows. Triangular, weeping eyes that exist in some overlapping reality adjacent to our own. The abandoned buildings are gone, demolished and replaced with new construction, modern houses with manicured lawns and carefully tended gardens. The new residents report nothing unusual, no whispers in the night, no strange figures at the forest's edge. Perhaps the ritual was tied specifically to those old structures, the decades of isolation creating conditions that cannot be replicated. Or perhaps the boundary remains permeable, the connection established through ritual maintaining itself through means we cannot comprehend. Perhaps she waits in the forest darkness, whispering messages we almost understand, watching through triangular eyes that weep for reasons beyond our knowledge. I still live in the Netherlands, where the forests are small and thoroughly documented, where population density should preclude anything truly unknown from existing undetected. Yet I no longer walk those forests after sunset. I no longer dismiss the impossible quite so readily, and sometimes in dreams I hear whispering that follows me into waking. Sounds that might be wind through pine needles, or might be something else entirely, something that found its way through a doorway we inadvertently helped to open. The morning star was never found. Just claims it disappeared from his shed the same night we witnessed the ritual. Whether it was taken by the people we observed or simply vanished remains another unanswered question in a mystery that defies conventional explanation. What remains certain is this: in the managed wilderness of the Netherlands, where every tree and path is catalogued and known, something exists that escapes classification, something that whispers in a woman's voice while remaining unseen. Something connected to ancient symbols and ritualistic patterns, something that watches through triangular eyes that weep for reasons I hope I never understand. There's something about the rural roots in western Pennsylvania that makes you feel simultaneously at peace and on edge. I've been a delivery driver for nearly 7 years now, weaving through twisted back roads and climbing steep hills that would make most city folks uneasy. December 2018 marked my fourth winter season with the company, and I'd grown accustomed to the unique challenges that came with delivering packages to remote homes tucked away in the Appalachian foothills. Most drivers avoided these routes, preferring the efficiency of suburban neighborhoods where you could hit dozens of houses in an hour. But I appreciated the solitude, the way the dense forest enveloped the narrow roads, branches forming tunnels overhead that seemed to swallow you whole. I knew most of the residents by now, hardy folks who chose isolation over convenience, who valued their privacy above all else. I'm forever grateful to people who leave package receptacles at the front of their driveways or create turnaround spots so I don't have to execute complex three-point turns on narrow gravel paths. But there are some houses that, due to their location or the specific instructions from the recipient, require packages to be left directly at the front door. This means navigating treacherous driveways that wind up mountains, often with no guardrails and sheer drops on one side. My supervisor, a broad-shouldered man we called Boss, had a saying, "Your safety comes first, the package second, and the customer's convenience dead last." I'd relied on those words many times when deciding to mark a delivery as inaccessible, but I also took pride in completing difficult deliveries that other drivers wouldn't attempt. The company-issued van I typically drove had been reliable. Through mud, snow, and ice, equipped with all-wheel drive and reinforced suspension. However, that December day, my regular vehicle was undergoing maintenance. Instead, I was stuck with a rental, a boxy white monstrosity from Pinsky Rental Services that handled like a refrigerator on wheels and featured an impossibly loud backup alarm that couldn't be disabled. Only for today, Boss had promised that morning, handing me the keys with an apologetic grimace. The regular van should be back tomorrow. The winter sun set early that time of year, usually around 4:30 p.m., plunging the backwoods into premature darkness. My shift had begun at 8:01 a.m., and by 4:00 p.m. I was making good time through my route, looking forward to getting back to the depot by 6:00 p.m. That was when everything changed. The day had proceeded normally until I noticed it, a medium-sized brown box wedged between the back seats of the van. I frowned, mentally accounting for all the packages I'd loaded that morning. Each one had been scanned, routed, and organized in the order of delivery. But somehow, this one had slipped through. I pulled over at a small country store, the kind that doubles as a gas station and local gathering spot. The parking lot was empty except for a rusted pickup truck, its owner presumably inside purchasing cigarettes or lottery tickets. I killed the engine and reached for the mystery package. The address label was slightly smudged, but legible. The destination was a house on Whispering Pine Road, a location I vaguely recognized as being situated in one of the most isolated areas of my route. Strangely, the tracking barcode showed no scan history. It was as if the package had materialized in my van without going through the normal processing channels. I checked my handheld device, scrolling through the remaining deliveries. The address wasn't listed. According to the official route, this package didn't exist. "That's odd," I muttered, examining the label more closely. The recipient's name was written in a spidery hand, J. Morrison. No phone number, no delivery instructions. Just the address and a pharmacy's return label, indicating the contents were likely medication. I hesitated, considering my options. The proper procedure would be to bring the package back to the depot for proper routing the following day. But if it contained medication, someone might be waiting for it urgently. The address was actually on my way back to the depot, though it would require a detour up one of the mountain roads. I glanced at my watch. 4:15 p.m. Darkness was already descending, the forest beyond the parking lot, transforming into an impenetrable wall of black. Against my better judgment, I decided to deliver the package. It would add maybe 30 minutes to my route, and someone's health might depend on it. I programmed the address into my GPS and pulled back onto the road, unaware that this simple decision would haunt me for years to come. The GPS directed me off the main highway onto a series of increasingly narrow roads. First asphalt, then gravel, then little more than dirt paths barely wide enough for my van. The trees closed in on both sides, branches scraping against the windows like skeletal fingers seeking entry. My headlights carved a weak tunnel through the darkness, hardly penetrating more than 20 feet ahead. I slowed to a crawl, straining to see the occasional reflective address markers that sporadically appeared on trees or mailboxes. The further I ventured from the main road, the more my unease grew. This area was different from my usual territory. Wilder somehow, more primeval. The houses became scarcer, set farther back from the road and from each other. Occasionally I'd glimpse lights through the trees, warm yellow squares floating in the darkness, signs of life amid the wilderness. But these became increasingly rare as I climbed higher into the hills. The GPS stuttered, losing signal momentarily before recalculating. In 1.2 miles, turn right onto Whispering Pine Road, the mechanical voice instructed, sounding unnaturally loud in the silence of the van. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my palms damp despite the chill air leaking through the poorly sealed windows. Something about this delivery felt wrong. The misrouted package, the unfamiliar territory, the deepening darkness, all conspired to set my nerves on edge. The temperature had dropped considerably as evening approached. The weatherman had predicted overnight lows in the 20s with a chance of freezing rain. Already I could see frost forming at the edges of the windshield, creeping inward like crystalline ivy. I rounded a bend and nearly missed the turnoff for Whispering Pine Road. It was barely marked, just a weathered wooden sign half concealed by overgrown foliage. I braked sharply and made the turn, wincing as the van's undercarriage scraped against the uneven terrain. This road was hardly deserving of the name. It was more of a trail, rutted and overgrown, clearly unused for extended periods. The vegetation brushed against the sides of the van, leaving soft scratching sounds that made my skin crawl. After another half-mile of painfully slow progress, the GPS announced, "You have arrived at your destination." I stopped the van and peered through the windshield. In the beam of my headlights, I could make out a battered metal mailbox bearing the number that matched my package. Beyond it, a driveway disappeared into the darkness, swallowed by the dense growth on either side. For a long moment, I sat there, engine idling, heat blasting ineffectually against the encroaching cold. Every instinct told me to turn around, to take the package back to the depot, and let someone else deal with it tomorrow. But I thought of the medication inside, potentially crucial to someone's well-being. And I admit there was professional pride involved too. I wasn't going to be defeated by a difficult delivery. Taking a deep breath, I put the van in drive and turned onto the driveway, branches scraping along the sides like nails on a chalkboard as I descended deeper into the darkness. The driveway twisted upward, carved into the side of the hill like a scar. What little gravel remained had long since been overrun by persistent vegetation, creating a green carpet that crunched unnervingly beneath the van's tires. On both sides, the forest pressed in, not the managed, orderly woods of a maintained property, but a wild tangle that suggested years of neglect. I kept the engine running, both for the headlights and for the psychological comfort of the rumbling motor. The driveway curved sharply, and suddenly a structure loomed before me, a tall cabin built directly into the hillside. The architecture was odd, almost organic, as if it had grown from the earth rather than been constructed upon it. The lower level appeared to be a garage, its doors closed and weathered. Above it, the main floor extended outward from the hill, supported by thick wooden beams that disappeared into the darkness below. A covered porch wrapped around the front, accessible by a set of wooden steps that climbed from the parking area. No exterior lights illuminated the property. The only sign that anyone might be home was the faintest orange glow visible through the windows, possibly from a fireplace rather than electric lighting. I parked as close to the steps as possible, angling the van's headlights toward the porch to create some visibility. The package felt unusually heavy in my hands as I retrieved it from the passenger seat. I double-checked the address on my device, though I knew it matched. This was definitely the place. The steps creaked ominously as I ascended, each one sagging slightly beneath my weight. The vegetation grew right up to the porch, thick vines twining around the railings as if trying to reclaim the structure for the wilderness. From this elevated vantage point, I could see just how isolated the property was. No other homes were visible in any direction, just the endless dark sea of forest stretching to the horizon. The nearest neighbor must have been miles away. I approached the front door, noticing details that increased my discomfort. The windows were smudged with years of grime, making it difficult to see inside clearly. The porch boards were warped and uneven, creating tripping hazards. A collection of peculiar objects hung from the rafters, what appeared to be animal bones and dried plants, possibly for practical purposes like drying herbs, but unsettling nonetheless in the dim light. As I raised my hand to knock, I shifted position slightly and caught a clearer glimpse through the front window. The interior was indeed lit only by a fireplace, casting wavering shadows across a room that seemed frozen in time. Mounted animal heads adorned the walls, their glass eyes reflecting the firelight with an eerie semblance of life. Worn leather furniture faced the flames, and various hunting implements hung from the walls. And there, sitting perfectly still in a wooden chair, directly facing the door, was an old man. The old man sat with a stillness that seemed inhuman. His posture was rigid, back perfectly straight, hands resting palms down on his thighs. He wore a maroon flannel shirt tucked into faded jeans, both garments appearing as weathered as the cabin itself. His white hair was cut short in a severe style that emphasized the angularity of his face, but it was his expression, or rather the complete lack of one, that disturbed me most. His features were arranged in perfect neutrality, devoid of the micro-expressions that naturally animate a human face. His eyes stared directly forward, seemingly focused on the front door where I stood. I had been trained to maintain a friendly demeanor with customers, but something about this man's unnatural stillness froze the smile on my face. I realized I'd been standing there for nearly a minute, package in hand, staring through the window at this strange resident. Embarrassment quickly replaced my unease. He was probably just an eccentric old man, annoyed that some delivery driver was peering into his home at dusk. I needed to complete the delivery and leave. I fumbled with my device, trying to record the delivery in our system. Since the package hadn't been properly routed, I had to manually enter the address and take a verification photo. The porch was too dark for the camera, so I activated my flashlight. When I looked up again, the old man was standing. The transition had happened in less than a second. In the brief moment, my attention had shifted to my device. There had been no rising from the chair, no natural movement. One instant he was seated, the next he was standing perfectly erect in exactly the same spot, arms still at his sides, face still expressionless. No elderly person moves that quickly. It was physically impossible. I nearly dropped the package, a cold sweat breaking out across my back despite the frigid air. I forced myself to complete the delivery confirmation, my fingers trembling as I snapped a photo of the package at the doorstep. I placed the box down carefully, deciding against knocking. Whatever medication this was, the resident was clearly awake and would find it. My priority now was leaving as quickly as possible. As I turned to go, I glanced again through the window. The old man was gone. I practically ran down the steps, nearly twisting my ankle on the uneven wood. When I reached the van, I yanked the door open and threw myself inside, locking the doors with a frantic jab at the button. The engine was still running, the headlights illuminating the empty porch where I'd left the package. My hands shook as I shifted into reverse, preparing for the difficult task of backing down the narrow driveway. That's when I remembered. The Penske rental had that infernal backup alarm that couldn't be disabled. There would be no quiet retreat from this place. The moment I shifted into reverse, the van's warning system began its piercing beep-beep-beep, shattering the forest silence like an air raid siren. Each sound seemed to echo among the trees, announcing my presence to everything within a mile radius. I grimaced, imagining the old man's reaction to the noise. Would he come outside to investigate? The thought spurred me to back up faster than was wise on the treacherous driveway, the van lurching over roots and rocks. The headlights swung wildly as I navigated the curves, creating disorienting shadows that seemed to move independently among the trees. The backup camera was nearly useless in the darkness, showing only a grainy, green-tinted view of the overgrown path behind me. Halfway down the driveway, I had to stop and pull forward to negotiate a particularly sharp bend. As the headlights swept across the forest, I caught a glimpse of something that made my breath catch, a flash of maroon among the trees. I blinked, uncertain if my eyes were playing tricks on me. When I looked again, There was nothing there but shadows and vegetation. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of eyes following my every move. The driveway seemed longer on the way out, each curve revealing only more darkness ahead rather than the promised exit. The beeping continued relentlessly, each electronic wail increasing my anxiety. I wanted nothing more than to shut it off, to move through this place in silence, unnoticed. After what felt like an eternity, I finally reached the main road. But my relief was short-lived as I realized I couldn't turn around in the narrow space. I would need to continue backing up along Whispering Pine Road until I found a spot wide enough to maneuver. I proceeded cautiously, the van's tires crunching on gravel and dead leaves. About 50 yards down the road, I found a small clearing that might serve my purpose. I executed a three-point turn, the van's engine straining as I navigated the uneven terrain. Finally facing the right direction, I accelerated perhaps faster than was prudent on the rough road, eager to put distance between myself and the strange cabin. As I passed the entrance to the driveway I'd just escaped, I couldn't resist looking back. There, standing at the mouth of the driveway, was the old man. He stood perfectly straight, arms at his sides, face expressionless in the wash of my taillights. There was no way he could have moved from the house to this position in the time it had taken me to back down the driveway. It was physically impossible, especially for someone of his apparent age. Yet there he stood, watching me leave with those blank, emotionless eyes. I pressed the accelerator to the floor, no longer concerned with the van's suspension or the treacherous road. My only thought was escape, putting as much distance as possible between myself and that unnatural figure. In my rearview mirror, I watched his silhouette grow smaller until it was swallowed by the darkness. But even when I could no longer see him, I felt his gaze following me, piercing through the night and the forest as if neither posed any barrier. I didn't report the incident when I returned to the depot. What would I say? That I was frightened by an old man who moved too quickly? That I'd delivered a package that wasn't properly in our system? Either admission would invite questions I preferred not to answer. So I completed my paperwork, returned the keys to the Penske rental, and drove home in my personal vehicle, constantly checking the rearview mirror as if expecting to see a maroon-clad figure on the road behind me. My apartment felt unusually empty that night, the familiar surroundings providing less comfort than I'd hoped. I double-checked the locks on my doors and windows before attempting to settle in for the evening. Sleep proved elusive. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the old man's expressionless face, his unnaturally quick movements, his impossible appearance at the end of the driveway. I tried to rationalize the experience. Perhaps there had been two old men, identical twins, playing some strange joke. Perhaps the isolation and gathering darkness had simply made me perceive the events incorrectly. But nothing could explain away the wrongness I'd felt, the primal fear that had gripped me in that moment. Around 3 a.m., I gave up on sleep and sat in my living room with all the lights on, television murmuring in the background for company. I found myself researching the area where I'd made the delivery, searching for any history or legends that might explain my experience. Whispering Pine Road yielded few results, mostly property records and tax assessments. The house itself had changed ownership several times over the decades, with long periods of vacancy between occupants. The current owner was listed simply as Morrison Estate, with no individual names attached. I discovered that the area had once been the site of a small mining operation in the late 1800s, abandoned after a collapse that claimed several lives. Some of the older locals still considered the hills to be unlucky, avoiding them except during hunting season. None of this explained what I'd encountered. As dawn approached, I made a decision. I would request a route change, citing personal reasons rather than detailing the true cause of my unease. I couldn't face the possibility of another delivery to that remote cabin, another encounter with its strange resident. When I arrived at work the next morning, exhausted but determined, I was relieved to find my regular van had been returned from service. The familiar vehicle felt like an old friend, reliable and safe compared to the Penske rental. Boss noticed my haggard appearance immediately. "Rough night?" he asked, handing me my route assignment for the day. I managed a non-committal shrug. Something like that. I scanned the delivery list with trepidation, half expecting to see Whispering Pine Road among the addresses. It wasn't there, and the relief made me lightheaded. "Actually," I said, I wanted to talk to you about possibly adjusting my route going forward. Boss raised an eyebrow. Problem areas? I hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. Just some difficult access issues on some of the mountain properties. Thinking it might be better assigned to someone with a four-wheel drive. He seemed to accept this explanation, promising to look into it. I thanked him and headed out for my deliveries, constantly checking my rearview mirror throughout the day, unable to shake the sensation of being observed. 3 years have passed since that December evening, yet the memory remains vivid, undiminished by time. I requested and received a transfer to a different route, still rural, but further east, away from those particular hills. I've never returned to Whispering Pine Road, never again encountered a package addressed to J. Morrison. My new route has its challenges: steep driveways, remote properties, the occasional unfriendly dog, but nothing that triggers the bone-deep fear I experienced that winter night. I've become known for my reliability, my willingness to deliver to locations other drivers avoid. But there are limits to what I'll endure. I refuse evening deliveries now, arranging my schedule to ensure I'm back at the depot before darkness falls. I've declined shifts during power outages when the rural areas are plunged into unrelieved blackness. And I never, under any circumstances, accept unscanned packages that mysteriously appear in my vehicle. These precautions have earned me a reputation for being somewhat eccentric, but I don't mind. My colleagues haven't seen what I've seen, haven't felt what I've felt. Sometimes, on winter evenings when I'm alone in my apartment, I find myself drawn to the window, peering out at the parking lot below. I scan the shadows between the parked cars, the spaces between the buildings, half expecting to glimpse a straight-backed figure in a maroon flannel shirt, watching me with that expressionless face. I've researched countless medical conditions and psychological phenomena, seeking an explanation for what I witnessed. The closest I've come is a theory about individuals with certain neurological disorders who can exhibit unnatural stillness and sudden movements, but nothing that would explain the impossibly quick transition from sitting to standing or the appearance at the end of the driveway. I've considered seeking professional help, having someone tell me it was just stress, a trick of the light, an overactive imagination. But deep down, I know what I saw was real. Something unnatural occurred that night. Something that defies rational explanation. Last month, while sorting through mail at my new apartment, I moved 6 months after the incident, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. I found a small package with no postage or shipping labels, just my name and address written in spidery handwriting that made my heart stutter in my chest. I didn't open it. I drove to a public dumpster miles from my home and disposed of it, then spent the night in a hotel, unable to face my empty apartment. I've submitted my resignation to the delivery company, effective next month. I've accepted a position with a warehouse distributor, indoor work, regular hours, no more remote deliveries to isolated properties. My supervisor seemed genuinely sorry to see me go, praising my reliability and work ethic. He doesn't understand that some costs are too high, some risks not worth taking. I still drive through rural areas occasionally, visiting friends or taking scenic routes on weekends. I appreciate the beauty of the landscape, the tranquility of the forests, but I never stop at isolated houses. I never venture down unmarked roads as dusk approaches, and I never ever deliver packages to strangers' doors after dark. Because some things once seen cannot be unseen. Some experiences fundamentally alter your perception of reality, of what's possible in this world. And some fears, once awakened, never truly subside. They merely wait, patient as an old man in a maroon shirt, for the moment when your guard drops and darkness falls. I don't know what waited for me at that cabin in the hills. I don't know who or what J. Morrison truly is. But I know that I escaped something terrible that winter evening, something that still haunts the edges of my consciousness. And I know, with absolute certainty, that I will never return to Whispering Pine Road, no matter what packages may need delivering. I was so sure it would be the perfect day for a winter hunt, the kind of morning that promises something special. January 27th, 2022, marked in my calendar weeks in advance. The forecast had predicted ideal conditions. Light snowfall overnight with clear skies by dawn. Perfect tracking conditions. perfect visibility. The car ride to Harrisville State Park felt oddly quiet, except for the heater rattling against the cold and my German Shepherd Jax panting in the back seat. Every few miles I glanced over my shoulder to make sure he was as fired up as I was. He always seemed to know when we were headed somewhere with open space and fresh air. "Today's the day, buddy," I said, reaching back to scratch behind his ears. His tail thumped against the seat in response. "We'll bring home something good." I'd been coming to these woods since I was a kid, tagging along with my uncle. Back then I was just the pack mule, carrying equipment and listening to hunting stories that grew more elaborate with each telling. Now, at 33, I had stories of my own, none quite as impressive as Uncle Roy's, but I was working on it. My truck's tires crunched through the fresh snow as I pulled into the nearly empty parking area. Only one other vehicle occupied the lot, an old blue pickup parked near the trailhead sign. Early bird, I thought, hoping they'd headed in a different direction. I preferred solitude on hunting days. Stepping onto the snow at the trailhead, I noticed how it sparkled under a low gray sky. A deep hush hung over everything. No birds calling, no rustling of leaves, just the crunch under my boots. The crisp bite in the air made me shiver, but I was too eager to let it bother me. Jax tugged at the flimsy retractable leash, sniffing and pawing at the ground, as if he already had a lead on something. I tried not to think about how cheaply made that leash felt in my hand. I should have invested in a proper lead, the kind designed for working dogs, not the discount store variety I'd grabbed on impulse. The plastic handle was already showing stress marks from previous outings, but I'd convinced myself it would hold for one more trip. "Easy, Jax," I murmured, adjusting my rifle strap across my shoulder. The weight of it felt reassuring, a connection to generations of hunters before me. I checked my pocket for extra ammunition and made sure my hunting knife was secure on my belt. The forest opened before us like a scene from a winter postcard. Fresh powder blanketed the ground, unmarred except for the occasional rabbit track or deer trail. Barren tree branches stretched toward the sky, their dark silhouettes stark against the snow. In the summer, these woods teemed with hikers and families. In winter, they became a different world altogether, silent, primal, and sometimes unforgiving. I breathed deeply, filling my lungs with the clean, sharp air. This was what I needed after months of being cooped up in my small accounting office, staring at spreadsheets until my vision blurred. Out here, surrounded by wilderness, I felt more like myself. Everything seemed serene at first, but I remember spotting strange canine tracks in the snow. They looked a bit larger than the usual fox prints I'd seen around these parts. My pulse quickened, and I could sense Jax honing in on the scent. In that moment, I convinced myself it was just a stray dog, or maybe a coyote passing through. Michigan winters can turn even familiar animals into elusive shadows. As we ventured deeper along the trail, the forest grew denser. Sunlight filtered through the canopy in weak, diluted beams that barely warmed the skin. I checked my watch, 9:17 a.m. We had plenty of daylight ahead of us, though in winter, the sun always seemed to race toward the horizon faster than expected. Jax's energy rose, and a little voice in the back of my mind warned me to keep calm. Instead, I started talking him up, telling him to find whatever's out there. It was an idiotic move. He was already excited, and my words only fueled his enthusiasm. Before I knew it, the plastic handle of that bargain leash started to bend. I gripped it tighter, but Jax gave one mighty pull, and the cord snapped. In the blink of an eye, he darted off between the trees, paws kicking up clouds of powder. "Jax!" I shouted, my voice sounding strangely muffled in the snow-laden air. "Jax, come!" The only response was the fading sound of his excited barking as he disappeared into the underbrush. I stood frozen, watching the spot where he'd vanished, suddenly aware of how alone I was. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees in an instant. I reached for my phone, thinking I should mark my location before going after him. The screen showed no service, not unusual for these parts. I tucked it away, cursing under my breath. I'd trained Jax to return to my whistle, but in his current state of excitement, I doubted he'd hear it, let alone obey. The beginnings of real worry crept into my mind. Jax was a domesticated animal, not a wild hunter. If he encountered something dangerous, a coyote, a bear, or even a territorial buck, he wouldn't know how to handle himself. The thought of him injured somewhere in these vast woods made my stomach lurch. I shouldered my rifle more securely and started after him, following his tracks in the fresh snow. I'd come to hunt, but suddenly the day had transformed into something altogether different, a desperate search for my companion. My hands shook as I shouted for him, but my voice seemed to vanish in the stillness. For a second I felt rooted to the spot, overwhelmed by the sight of my dog disappearing into a wild expanse. Then my body lurched forward and I tore after him, trudging through snow that seemed to get deeper with every step. I could see his tracks, spaced far apart from his bounding stride. The forest around me felt larger and colder now that I was alone. My breathing started to get rough, a mix of worry and the frantic pace I was forcing on myself. If Jax found an actual coyote, or something worse, he might get hurt. And if I couldn't keep up with him, he could be gone for good. The deeper I went, the more anxious I became. It felt like each tree watched me rush by, not a single branch shifting. The hush had turned ominous, and I kept expecting something to bolt out of the shadows. I tried calling Jax again, voice cracking. The wind picked up, whistling through the bare branches overhead. It carried flecks of snow that stung my exposed cheeks and forehead. I pulled my hat lower, wishing I'd worn a face mask. My breath clouded before me in rapid puffs as I pushed forward, following Jax's increasingly scattered tracks. In the distance I heard him barking, but the echo played tricks on my ears, making it impossible to pinpoint his direction. I pressed on, ignoring the tremor in my legs. The ground was slick in places, hidden ice patches waiting for a misstep. Panic started to creep into my thoughts. If I lost the trail, there was no guarantee I'd find it again. Jax was a big dog, but the woods are bigger. My mind raced with possibilities, each worse than the last. What if he fell through ice on the creek? What if he encountered a pack of coyotes? What if he simply ran too far and couldn't find his way back? The isolation of the forest suddenly felt oppressive rather than liberating. I checked my watch again, 10:03 a.m. Less than an hour since we'd started, but it felt like an eternity. I'd covered nearly a mile following Jax's trail, moving deeper into a section of the park I wasn't familiar with. The trees here grew closer together, their branches forming a dense network overhead that blocked most of the already weak sunlight. So I pushed forward, adrenaline urging me to keep going no matter how numb my fingers felt or how stiff my joints had become from the cold. There was only one goal at that moment: find Jax, latch onto him somehow, and get the both of us out of this place. Little did I know, the real danger hadn't even begun. The terrain began to change, sloping gradually downward. I knew the creek ran through this part of the forest, a narrow, rocky waterway that would be partially frozen this time of year. In summer, it was little more than a pleasant babble over smooth stones. In winter, it transformed into a treacherous ribbon of ice and frigid water. I slowed my pace, trying to regain control of my breathing. The exertion had me sweating beneath my layers, a dangerous condition in cold weather. If I pushed too hard and soaked my clothes with perspiration, hypothermia would become a real threat when I eventually stopped moving. Jax's barking grew louder, more insistent. He had found something. I quickened my pace again, recklessness overtaking caution. I caught a glimpse of Jax darting onto a narrow, half-forgotten trail that ran along the creek. Even though I'd been here in the summer, everything looked completely foreign under so much snow. My boots hit patches of ice more than solid ground, and the edges of the path were dangerously slick. But I barely thought twice. I needed to catch up before he vanished for good. The slope ahead was brutal. I tried to walk carefully, but Jax was already bounding up ahead, his tracks spaced too far apart for me to match in a normal stride. I hurried, and my foot slid on a hidden patch of ice. One minute I was upright, the next I was hitting the ground so hard it jarred my teeth. My lungs seized up. My vision blurred around the edges. Instinct made me twist, trying to dig my hands into the snow, but I was on a downhill slide. Every rock and jutting root bruised me on the way down. I reached out for anything to stop the momentum. My fingers brushed something, a branch maybe, but it snapped instantly. The world spun around me, a kaleidoscope of white snow, gray sky, and dark tree trunks. I lost all sense of direction as I tumbled, my rifle tearing free from my shoulder strap and clattering somewhere nearby. Pain exploded in my side as I collided with what felt like a boulder. I gasped, trying to catch my breath, but the momentum carried me further. Time seemed to stretch and compress simultaneously. In reality, the fall probably lasted only seconds. But each impact, each revolution felt like its own distinct moment of terror. I couldn't tell which way was up. All I knew was the sickening sensation of having no control over my body's movement. The hillside rushed by in a blur of white and brown. Then I slammed onto the creek, breaking through a layer of ice that gave way under my weight. The water almost took my breath away. It was a cold so intense my muscles clenched. The shock shot through my limbs, making it hard to think straight. Struggling onto all fours, I felt the stream creeping up my elbows. My jacket and pants soaked it up like a sponge. The creek wasn't deep, perhaps 2 feet at its center, but the temperature was brutal. January in northern Michigan meant water temperatures just above freezing. The human body can withstand such cold for only minutes before hypothermia sets in. One wrong move and I'd submerge my entire body in that freezing mess. With a desperate push, I managed to get my torso onto thicker ice near the bank, then crawled until I was clear of the water. That's when the pain in my leg flared up. My pant leg was torn and blood was staining the snow. I tried to stand, wincing as my knee threatened to buckle. There was a sharp pulsing throb like a warning light in my brain. I looked up the slope I'd just descended. It wasn't particularly steep, but the combination of ice and snow had made it treacherous. My rifle lay about halfway up, partially buried in snow. I'd need to retrieve it, but first I had to assess the damage to my leg. I remember thinking that I'd be in deep trouble if an animal picked up the scent of fresh blood. With my luck, there might be a hungry coyote lurking in the distance, watching for an easy meal. I peeled back the torn fabric of my pants to reveal a jagged gash on my right knee, about 3 inches long. It wasn't dangerously deep, but it was bleeding steadily. I scooped up a handful of clean snow and pressed it against the wound, gritting my teeth against the sting. The cold would help constrict the blood vessels at least. Looking around, I realized I'd lost my bearings completely. The creek stretched in both directions, curving out of sight among the trees. The sun was hidden behind uniform gray clouds, offering no directional guidance. My phone was still in my pocket, but when I pulled it out, the screen remained dark. The impact or the water had killed it. Panic threatened to overwhelm me. I was injured, soaking wet in freezing temperatures, with no communication and no clear path back to civilization, and my dog was still missing. Jax showed up completely unfazed, panting like he'd just had the time of his life. Relief washed over me, but anger flickered too. I couldn't handle him bolting again, so I grabbed the broken cord from his side and tied it around my wrist. "Where the hell have you been?" I rasped, my voice shaking with cold and relief. He just wagged his tail, oblivious to my predicament. In his mind, this was all part of a grand adventure. For me, it was rapidly becoming a nightmare. My fingers shook from the cold, and it felt like the wind was trying to slice through every layer of clothing I had on. I knew I needed to move, to get circulation flowing through my extremities. Hypothermia was the immediate threat. Wet clothes in winter conditions could kill faster than almost anything else in these woods. I looked at my watch again, surprised to find it still working. 10:37 a.m. The fall and its aftermath had consumed barely half an hour, though it felt like hours had passed. I still had daylight, but my situation was precarious. Climbing up the bank became a test of will. The snow soaked into my gloves each time I touched the ground, and I was limping so badly I had to half-drag my leg. I managed to retrieve my rifle, brushing off the snow and checking for damage. The scope seemed intact, a small mercy. I tried to orient myself, searching for landmarks. The park covered nearly 2,000 acres, and I'd wandered well off the marked trails. The creek might lead to a more traveled area, but following it would mean slower going. The alternative was striking out directly through the woods, hoping to intersect a trail. I decided to climb to higher ground first, to get a better view. Each step sent pain shooting through my injured knee, and my wet clothes had begun to freeze in places, becoming stiff and even more uncomfortable. Jack stayed close now, sensing perhaps that something was wrong. When I reached a small clearing at the top of a rise, I paused to catch my breath. The landscape spread out before me, an endless sea of trees, their dark trunks stark against the snow. No sign of trails, roads, or structures, just wilderness stretching in every direction. A new wave of fear washed over me. I was more lost than I'd initially thought. The familiar paths I'd traveled hundreds of times might as well have been in another country. Winter had transformed everything, erasing the markers I relied on during warmer months. It must have been 2 miles or more back to the car, but it felt like crossing some frozen wasteland. The quiet of the woods did nothing to calm me. Every crack of an ice-laden branch overhead made me flinch, and I kept checking behind me, convinced something might step out from the trees. I tried to remember the basics of wilderness survival. Priority 1, find shelter. Priority 2, build a fire. But my matches were soaked, my lighter somewhere in the snow where I'd fallen. Besides, I wasn't stranded in remote wilderness, I was in a state park. There had to be a way out. I decided to head in what I hoped was a northerly direction, where the main trail should be. Each step was agony, but standing still meant certain hypothermia. My wet jeans had begun to freeze, creating a bizarre stiffness that made walking even more difficult. Time seemed to stretch and contract. The gray sky offered no clues about the hour. Only my watch, which I checked compulsively, told me that minutes were indeed passing. Jack stayed by my side, occasionally looking up at me with what seemed like concern. The cord around my wrist was a lifeline now, keeping us together. My thoughts grew increasingly scattered, a bad sign. I knew hypothermia affected cognitive function first. I forced myself to focus, to put one foot in front of the other. Just keep moving. Just keep moving. When I finally spotted the faint outline of the parking lot, my throat tightened. That battered old car looked like the only safe place on earth. I nearly collapsed against it, fumbling for my keys, my wet gloves making it impossible to grip anything. Jax hopped in the back seat on his own, tail wagging, while I cranked the heater and peeled off my soaked jacket. I threw my rifle onto the floor, realizing there was no way I'd be firing any shots in this condition. My hands were numb and I was still bleeding. The digital clock on the dashboard read 12:23 p.m. Nearly 3 hours had passed since we'd set out. It felt like days. The first aid kit was tucked under the passenger seat, and I tore into it like a lifeline, bandaging my knee with unsteady hands. Warm air finally blasted from the vents, but my teeth kept chattering, and I couldn't stop replaying each second of that descent down the hill. I peeled off my frozen gloves, wincing as circulation returned to my fingers in painful tingles. My hands were pale, with alarming white patches on several fingertips, the early signs of frostbite. I held them directly in front of the heating vent, enduring the burning sensation as they slowly warmed. The bleeding from my knee had slowed, but the wound needed proper cleaning and probably stitches. My entire right side ached from the impacts during the fall. I'd be a mass of bruises tomorrow, assuming I made it to tomorrow. I reached for a bottle of water I'd left in the cup holder, my throat suddenly parched. The liquid was ice cold but felt like life itself flowing down my throat. I offered some to Jax, who lapped eagerly from my cupped palm. Looking out at the woods through the steaming windshield, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief at my escape, anger at my own carelessness, and a new respect for the power of nature. Those trees that had seemed so peaceful, so inviting just hours ago now looked menacing, as if they'd been waiting to claim me. I needed to get to urgent care. The gash in my knee required professional attention, and I needed to be checked for hypothermia. The nearest medical facility was in Harrisville, about 20 minutes away. I wasn't sure I could drive safely, but I had no choice. Eventually I drove away, the engine's hum mixing with the rush of thoughts in my head. Jack settled in, eyes half closed. I kept glancing at him through the rearview mirror, feeling a jumbled mess of relief, anger, and gratitude. That stretch of creek could have become my grave if I'd hit my head or gone under the ice. The miles slipped by in a haze of slush and salted roads. I kept thinking how close I'd come to not making it out. One broken leash, one moment of distraction, and suddenly nature had me in its teeth, ready to swallow me whole. The urgent care facility was busy with the usual winter casualties: broken wrists from ice falls, children with severe colds, elderly patients with breathing difficulties. I sat in the waiting room, still shivering despite the building's warmth. Jax had to stay in the car, where I'd left the engine running for heat. I checked on him through the window every few minutes, irrationally afraid he might disappear again. When the doctor finally examined me, his expression was grave. "You're lucky," he said, cleaning my wound with antiseptic that stung worse than the initial injury. "Another hour out there in wet clothes and we'd be treating you for severe hypothermia. As it is, you have mild frostbite on your fingers and early hypothermia." He sutured my knee, 7 stitches in total, and wrapped it in clean bandages. "Stay off it for a few days," he advised. "And no more winter hikes alone." I didn't tell him I hadn't been alone. Somehow explaining about Jax felt like admitting to a deeper failure, that I couldn't even control my own dog, let alone navigate the wilderness safely. The prescription for antibiotics and pain relievers felt like a tangible reminder of my mistake. I paid the bill, grimacing at the cost, another consequence of my poor judgment. Back in the car, Jax greeted me with his usual enthusiasm. I scratched behind his ears mechanically, my mind still processing the events of the day. I knew I'd need to get my leg checked out. I needed dry clothes and something hot to drink. More than anything, though, I needed to get home, to let the warmth of the house chase away the memory of that frigid water. The drive home was longer than usual, or perhaps it just felt that way. Every bump in the road sent pain shooting through my knee. The heater blasted at maximum, but I still felt a deep chill that seemed to radiate from my bones outward. I passed familiar landmarks. The gas station where I always filled up before hunting trips. The diner where I sometimes stopped for breakfast. The turnoff to my neighborhood. Each site reinforced that I was returning to safety, to civilization. Yet I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched by something in the woods. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. I couldn't decide if I felt lucky or just plain foolish. The house looked like a sanctuary, warm lights glowing in the windows, smoke curling from the chimney where I'd left a fire banked that morning. Jax bounded from the car as soon as I opened the door, eager to return to familiar territory. I followed more slowly, each step a reminder of how close I'd come to disaster. Inside, the warmth enveloped me like an embrace. I peeled off my damp clothes, leaving them in a heap by the door. A hot shower washed away the physical remnants of the ordeal. But the memory remained vivid. The sensation of falling. The crack of ice, the mind-numbing cold of the water. Later, wrapped in a blanket on the couch with Jax at my feet, I sipped hot tea and contemplated how quickly things had spiraled out of control. One moment I was a confident hunter in familiar territory. The next, I was fighting for survival. That night, sleep came in fitful bursts. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt myself falling again, heard the crack of ice, felt the shocking cold of the creek water. I'd jolt awake, heart racing, to find Jax watching me with concerned eyes from his bed in the corner. The pain in my knee throbbed in time with my heartbeat, a persistent reminder of my brush with disaster. The antibiotics sat on my bedside table along with the painkillers, which I'd been reluctant to take. Somehow, I felt I deserved the pain, a necessary reminder of my foolishness. As dawn broke, I limped to the window and looked out at my backyard. The same snow that had nearly claimed me in the forest now looked benign, even beautiful as it glittered in the first rays of sunlight. Nature's dual faces, serene beauty and merciless killer, had never been clearer to me. I'd been hunting these woods since I was a teenager, had always prided myself on my outdoorsmanship. Yet one moment of carelessness had nearly cost me everything. The cheap leash, the excitement egging Jax on, the reckless pursuit, all preventable mistakes. Over coffee, I found myself online, ordering a proper hunting harness for Jax, the kind with reinforced stitching and a secure clasp that wouldn't fail under pressure. I added a personal locator beacon to my cart as well, along with waterproof matches and an emergency blanket for my pack. Small investments that could mean the difference between life and death. The doctor had advised staying off my leg, but restlessness drove me to pace the house, Jax following at my heels as if afraid to let me out of his sight. Perhaps he sensed how close we'd come to not making it home at all. I canceled my plans for the coming weekend, another hunting trip I'd been looking forward to for months. It wasn't just the injury keeping me away. It was a newfound respect for the dangers lurking in those familiar woods. I needed time to recover, not just physically but mentally, to rebuild the confidence that had been shattered along with the ice on that creek. In the following days, friends called to check in. I told them a sanitized version of events, a slip on ice, a minor injury. The full story felt too raw, too personal to share. How could I explain the moment when I realized I might not make it out? The primal fear that had gripped me as I crawled from that freezing water, the desperate trek back, each step a battle against pain and cold. A week later, my knee was healing well, though the doctor warned I might feel twinges in cold weather for years to come, a permanent souvenir of my misadventure. The frost-bitten patches on my fingers had peeled, revealing new, tender skin beneath. I limped to my front door, Jax by my side, vowing I'd never let a scrap of cheap plastic determine our fate again. The forest would be waiting when I was ready to return, not as a conquered territory, but as a powerful force deserving of respect and careful preparation. Winter hunts aren't games, and careless decisions can turn a simple outing into a nightmare. Nature doesn't care about experience or confidence. It simply exists, indifferent to human folly. This lesson, etched into my memory and my flesh, would guide every future venture into the wilderness. As I scratched Jax behind the ears, watching snowflakes begin to fall outside my window, I felt a complex mixture of gratitude for our survival and humility in the face of forces far greater than myself. I had entered those woods as a hunter, confident and prepared, or so I thought. I had emerged as something else, a student perhaps, with a newfound appreciation for the thin line between adventure and disaster.